Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've never told this story to many people. Most folks don't believe me when I do, and honestly, I don't blame them. I wouldn't believe it either if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. But I know what I saw that day in March 1969, and it stayed with me for all these years. I was 34 at the time, working my prune orchard just outside Forest Grove, Oregon. It was a crisp morning, one of those early spring days where the air still has that winter bite. But the sun promises warmer days ahead. I remember I'd put on my old canvas jacket over 2 layers because the wind was cutting right through my clothes when I started up before dawn. I'd been up since 5 that morning, had my usual breakfast of eggs and toast that my wife had left out before she headed to her sister's place in Portland. The coffee was bitter that morning. I remember that clearly because I'd let it sit too long on the stove while I was checking the weather report on the radio. They'd said it would be clear, good for spraying, which was exactly what I needed to hear. By 7, I was on my old farm tractor, the one with the red paint all chipped and faded from years of use. I was working the boundary of my orchard, spraying the trees near where my property meets up with the Johnsons' land. Their place ran up against David's Hill, nothing special, just a modest slope covered in native brush and trees that separated our properties. I'd been at it for about 2 hours, the familiar rumble of the tractor beneath me almost putting me in a trance. The spray tank was nearly empty, and I was thinking about heading back to refill when something caught my eye over on the Johnson property, maybe 100 yards away. At first, I thought it was Pete Johnson himself. Maybe out checking his fence line or hunting for that dog of his that was always getting loose. But something didn't seem right. Whatever was moving through that brush was too big to be Pete, or anyone else I knew for that matter. The brush over there is thick, blackberry brambles mixed with Oregon grape and salal. I know because I'd helped Pete clear some of it the previous fall. That brush stood taller than my 6-foot frame, I'd guess around 6'3" or so, but this thing, its shoulders were clearly visible above the brush line. I eased off the throttle and let the tractor idle. The figure was moving at a steady pace along the hillside, not rushing, just walking with purpose. That's when I realized what was wrong with what I was seeing. It wasn't a person, couldn't be. Its entire body was covered in what looked like hair, not fur exactly, but a coarse, shaggy covering that reminded me of a horse's winter coat, only darker, almost black, but not the shiny black of a well-groomed animal. It was dull, dirty looking, like it had been rolling in soil. I remember thinking how strange the head looked. It was rounded on top, but the weird thing was there didn't seem to be any neck. The head just sat directly on these massive shoulders, and those shoulders must have been at least twice as wide as mine. I cut the engine completely. The sudden silence was jarring, but I didn't want the noise to alert whatever this was to my presence. I'm not sure why. Instinct, I guess. With the engine off, I could hear birds singing and the distant sound of a car on the main road, but nothing from this creature. It was moving silently despite its size. I climbed up onto the hood of my tractor to get a better look. My heart was racing now, and my mouth had gone completely dry. The thing kept walking, arms swinging naturally at its sides. Those arms seemed proportional to its body, not overly long like I'd heard some people describe in those tabloid stories. It was leaning forward slightly as it walked, not hunched over dramatically, just a slight forward tilt at the waist. I wanted to call out to see if it would turn around so I could get a look at its face, but something stopped me. Fear, probably. Not panic, just a deep, primal unease that kept me frozen in place, watching. It never did turn around. It just kept walking at that same deliberate pace, heading toward a walnut grove that marked the edge of Johnson's property. When it reached those trees, it disappeared among them, and I lost sight of it completely. I must have stayed there on the hood of my tractor for another 15 minutes, just staring at the spot where it had vanished, half expecting it to emerge on the other side of the grove. It never did. When I finally snapped out of it, I felt cold sweat running down my back despite the chill in the air. My hands were shaking as I climbed down and restarted the tractor. I finished my work in a daze, constantly glancing over toward that hillside. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying what I'd seen over and over in my mind. My wife noticed something was off, but I just told her I was worried about frost hitting the orchard. I didn't tell her, or anyone, what I'd seen. Not then. 3 days later, curiosity got the better of me. I walked over to the Johnson property, telling myself I was just being neighborly, checking in. Pete wasn't home, which was just as well. I made my way to the hillside where I'd seen the figure. The brush was undisturbed, no broken branches or obvious signs of passage that I could see. But standing there, looking up at that brush, I was struck again by just how tall whatever I saw must have been. I'm 6 feet even, and the brush tops were a good 4 or 5 inches above my head. That meant this thing's shoulders had to be at least 7 feet high, probably more. I found a fallen branch about 8 feet long and stood it up against a tree. Looking at it, I estimated that what I saw was between 7.5 and 8.5 feet tall. The thought made me dizzy. On my way back home, I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a series of depressions in a muddy patch near a seasonal creek that cut through the property. They weren't clear prints, just shallow impressions, but they were big, much bigger than my size 11 boots. I tried to tell myself they could have been anything. Maybe Pete had been out in his waders, or it could have been deer beds. But I knew better. Over the next few weeks, I found myself making excuses to work the boundary of my property. I'd wake up early, hoping to catch another glimpse. But whatever I'd seen never returned. Or if it did, it was smart enough to stay hidden. I finally broke down and told Pete about it over beers one evening in April. I expected him to laugh, but he didn't. He got real quiet instead, took a long pull of his beer, and then told me his grandfather used to talk about wild men in the hills, said the local tribes had stories about them going back centuries. Pete had always thought they were just stories meant to keep kids from wandering too far into the woods. That summer, I heard reports of strange noises near David's Hill, howls that didn't sound like coyotes or any other animal people recognized, livestock acting skittish. A couple of hikers claimed they found enormous footprints on a rarely used trail. The local paper ran a small story about it tucked away on page 5. They called it Bigfoot fever and treated it like a joke. But I wasn't laughing. I knew what I'd seen. What bothers me most, even all these years later, isn't just the creature itself. It's how it made me feel. There was nothing threatening about its behavior. It was just walking, minding its own business. But seeing it shook something loose in me, some fundamental certainty about the world and what exists in it. I'm 79 now, and I've never seen anything like it since. The orchard's long gone, sold off when my arthritis got too bad to manage the work. The Johnson property was developed into housing 15 years back. David's Hill is still there, but it's changed. More houses, fewer wild spaces. Sometimes I drive by the old place and look toward that hillside. I wonder if it's still out there somewhere, or if there are others like it, moving quietly through what remains of the wilderness, keeping to themselves, watching us from the shadows of the trees. I don't expect anyone to believe me. That's not why I'm sharing this now. I guess I just needed to put it down somewhere before I'm gone, because whatever I saw that day in March 1969 was real. It wasn't a man in a suit. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't my imagination. And the most unsettling part, it saw me too. I'm certain of it. Even though it never turned its head, something tells me it knew I was there watching. It knew. And it chose to keep walking, to disappear back into its world, a world that exists alongside ours, but somehow remains hidden from view. That's what really haunts me after all these years. Not fear of the creature, but the realization that there are things sharing this earth with us that we pretend don't exist, because acknowledging them would force us to reconsider everything we think we know, and most people aren't ready for that. I wasn't ready for it either. But on that ordinary March morning, working my orchard like any other day, reality shifted for me, and there's no going back from that. Story 2. I've been hesitant to share this for a long time. It's been over 50 years. But what I saw that summer day in 1970 still gives me chills when I think about it. I don't care if people believe me or not anymore. I know what I saw. Back then, I was 23 and had just finished my service as a border guard in the Israeli army. I'd moved to Oregon that spring, staying with my uncle while I figured out what to do with my life after military service. Coming from Israel to the lush forests of the Pacific Northwest was like entering another world. All that green, the massive trees, the constant moisture in the air, it was the opposite of what I'd known. I was determined not to lose my military skills, especially my marksmanship. In Israel, staying sharp could mean the difference between life and death. So every weekend, I'd drive out along the Sandy River looking for secluded spots to practice target shooting. The Sandy runs west from Mount Hood through what locals call the Hoodland Corridor before it turns north to meet the Columbia River near Troutdale. Beautiful country, but wild in places. It was mid-July, around 3 in the afternoon. The day was warm but not hot. Perfect Oregon summer weather. I'd been driving for about an hour, taking some of the logging roads that branch off from the highway. I wanted somewhere isolated where my shooting wouldn't bother anyone. I found this meadow east of the river, maybe half a mile in from the main road. It was perfect. Open space with a good hillside behind it as a backstop for bullets. I parked my uncle's old Ford pickup at the edge of the clearing and got out to survey the area before setting up my targets. That's when I noticed something odd. The hair on the back of my neck stood up immediately. A sensation I'd learned to trust during my military service. Something felt wrong. The meadow was beautiful, surrounded by dense forest on 3 sides, but unnaturally quiet. In midsummer, you expect to hear birds, insects, the rustling of small animals. There was nothing, just silence. About 50 yards into the meadow, I spotted a cluster of birch trees that looked wrong. As I approached, I realized what I was seeing, and it stopped me cold. About 8 or 9 birch saplings, each around 4.5 inches in diameter, had been snapped off at about 6 feet high, not cut, snapped. Anyone who knows anything about trees knows how much force that would take. These weren't twigs. These were solid young trees. But that wasn't even the strangest part. The tops of these trees had been carefully woven together, creating a kind of dome-shaped structure. It wasn't random or accidental. This was deliberate construction, forming what looked like a nest or shelter large enough to hold 3 or 4 grown people. I approached it slowly, my heart pounding. My military training kept me alert, scanning the tree line, looking for movement. The structure was incredible in its complexity. Smaller branches had been woven through the larger ones, creating a surprisingly sturdy framework. Some of the leafy parts had been positioned to provide cover from above. This wasn't the work of a bear or any animal I knew of. This required planning, dexterity, and intelligence. As I circled the structure, I caught a whiff of something that made my stomach turn. It was a smell I recognized from my time in the army, the distinctive odor of death, but with something else layered over it. Something musky and animal-like, but not like any animal I'd encountered before. Following my nose, I discovered the source about 15 feet from the structure. There was a pile of rabbit carcasses, maybe 8 or 9 of them, all neatly gutted. The strange thing was that only the innards had been eaten. The meat had been left behind. They weren't old kills either. Some looked quite fresh, maybe from that morning. I'd been a hunter since I was a teenager, and I'd seen plenty of animal kills. Predators don't waste meat like this. They certainly don't pile their kills in one spot, and they definitely don't only eat the organs while leaving the rest untouched. This was something else entirely. My mind was racing. I'd heard stories about Bigfoot or Sasquatch since moving to Oregon, but had dismissed them as local folklore. Standing there in that silent meadow, looking at that structure and those carcasses, I suddenly wasn't so sure. I decided to look for tracks. The ground was fairly dry due to the summer weather, but near the edge of the trees where the soil was damper, I found something that made me freeze. It was a footprint, or rather half a footprint, where something had stepped from the softer ground onto rockier terrain. It was huge, easily 16 inches long from what I could see, with 5 distinct toes. It was a human-like foot, but massive. No bear makes a print like that. Just then, I heard something that made my blood run cold, a sound from deep in the forest. It wasn't quite a howl, wasn't quite a scream. It was somewhere in between, and it echoed through the trees with a depth that told me whatever made it was big, very big. That was enough for me. I wasn't armed except for my target shooting rifle in the truck, and some instinct told me that wouldn't be enough if I encountered whatever made that structure. I hurried back to my vehicle, constantly checking over my shoulder, feeling like I was being watched from the tree line. As I reached the truck, I heard a crash from the forest edge, like something large moving through the underbrush. I didn't stick around to find out what it was. I got in, started the engine, and got out of there as fast as I could on that rough forest road. I drove straight to the nearest forest ranger station, about 20 miles away. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel the whole time. When I arrived, I probably looked half crazy. A young guy with a foreign accent, talking about tree structures and giant footprints. There were 2 rangers on duty. The older one, a guy named Miller, listened politely, but I could tell he thought I was exaggerating or confused. But the younger ranger, I remember his name was Jim, seemed genuinely interested. He'd grown up in the area and said there had been similar reports over the years, though nothing recently. Jim agreed to come back with me to check out the site. I was relieved not to be going alone. On the drive back, he told me about other strange things people had reported in the forests around Mount Hood. Unusual structures, unexplained noises at night, livestock going missing. He didn't use the word Bigfoot, but I could tell that's what he was talking about. We reached the turnoff to the meadow around 5:30. The sun was lower, but still plenty of daylight left. Jim brought a camera and some measuring tools. As we approached the meadow on foot, I noticed he kept his hand near his service revolver. That didn't exactly calm my nerves. The structure was still there, exactly as I'd left it. Jim whistled softly when he saw it. "This is unusual," he said, which I took to be ranger speak for holy shit. He took several photos of the woven trees from different angles, then examined the breaks in the trunks. "These weren't cut," he confirmed. "They were snapped with tremendous force. Look at how clean some of these breaks are." He ran his fingers along one of the broken trunks. "Whatever did this is incredibly strong." We moved to the rabbit carcasses next. Some had been disturbed, probably by scavengers that had moved in after I left, but most were still there in their neat pile. Jim photographed these too, then crouched down to examine them more closely. "The organs have been removed and eaten with what looks like precision," he said, poking at one of the fresher carcasses with a stick. "This isn't typical predator behavior." I showed him where I'd seen the partial footprint, but in the hours since I'd left, it had been obscured by forest debris. Jim searched the area carefully and found another print about 10 feet away, this one more distinct. He placed his boot next to it for scale in a photograph. His size 11 boot looked tiny beside that print. As he was measuring the depth of the impression, we heard it again. That same howl scream from earlier, but closer this time, much closer. Jim stood up quickly, his face suddenly serious. "We should go." he said quietly, gathering his equipment. Now. We hadn't made it halfway back to the vehicles when we heard crashing sounds from the forest, heavy footfalls and breaking branches. Something big was moving parallel to us, just inside the tree line. Jim drew his revolver but kept it pointed down. "Don't run," he said under his breath. "Just keep walking steadily." The crashing sounds kept pace with us, sometimes getting closer, sometimes farther away, but always there. I kept my eyes fixed on the truck ahead, willing it to be closer. The 50 yards back to our vehicles felt like miles. Just as we reached the edge of the clearing where we'd parked, there was an enormous crash from the forest, like a small tree being pushed over. Then silence. We didn't waste any time. We got in our vehicles. Jim had followed me in his Forest Service truck and drove out of there. Jim led the way, driving faster than was probably safe on those rough roads. Back at the ranger station, Jim filed a report and stored the film from his camera. He was professional, but I could tell he was shaken. He promised to develop the photos and contact me, taking my uncle's phone number. 3 days later, Jim called. The photographs had come out clearly. The structure, the carcasses, the footprint next to his boot. He'd shown them to his supervisor, who'd been skeptical but couldn't explain what we'd found. Jim told me confidentially that there had been other reports over the years, but the Forest Service didn't officially acknowledge them to avoid encouraging curiosity seekers who might get lost or hurt in the wilderness. I asked if he thought it was Bigfoot. There was a long pause on the line. "I've worked these forests for 7 years," he finally said. "I've seen bears, cougars, all kinds of wildlife. Whatever built that structure and left those prints isn't any animal I'm familiar with, and it's not human either." I never went back to that meadow. I found other places to practice my shooting, always in more open areas with better visibility. Sometimes when I was in the forest, I'd get that feeling again, of being watched. I'd hear strange knocking sounds or find broken branches that didn't look like normal forest damage. Once, camping near Mount Hood with friends, we all heard that same howl scream in the night. My friends thought it was a cougar, but I knew better. I moved away from Oregon in 1973, but I still think about what Jim and I saw that day. I don't know if it was Bigfoot or Sasquatch or whatever you want to call it. All I know is that something intelligent and powerful was living in those woods, something that wasn't supposed to exist. Jim sent me copies of the photos before I left Oregon, but they were lost in a move years ago. I've often wondered what happened to the originals in the Forest Service files. Part of me hopes they're still there somewhere, evidence of what we found on that summer afternoon by the Sandy River, when the forest went silent and something watched us from the trees. Story 3. I've never been much for sharing personal things, especially not something like this that makes me sound, well, I don't know how it makes me sound. Crazy maybe, but I can't shake it. Even after all these years, I need to get this off my chest. It was late summer, 1963, August, I think. Gainesville was different back then, not the busy college town it is today. I lived with my mother in a small house near Northwest 21st Terrace and Northwest 3rd Avenue. Most folks don't know what that area used to look like. Today, it's all developed with houses packed in like sardines, but back then, just woods. Miles of thick Florida woods with only a handful of houses scattered around. That particular day was hot as hell, even by Florida standards. The kind of sticky heat that makes your clothes cling to you the minute you step outside. I remember because I was jogging over to visit the Hendersons, who lived about half a mile away. Not really jogging like people do today with fancy shoes and water bottles, just moving at a good clip to get there before dinner. I was about halfway there when something made me turn my head toward the tree line. I don't know what it was. No sound that I recall, just some instinct. And there it was. I've replayed that moment in my head thousands of times since then. At first, my brain tried to make sense of what I was seeing. A bear standing upright? No. We didn't have bears around Gainesville like that. A really tall man, but the proportions were all wrong. This thing was standing just inside the trees, partially hidden by the shadows, but clearly visible enough. It was huge. I'd estimate around 7.5 feet tall, maybe taller. The shoulders were impossibly broad, much wider than any human I'd ever seen. It wasn't wearing clothes. Instead, it was covered in this thick, dark hair or fur, not patchy like a mangy animal, but a full coat. What really got me were the eyes. Large, round, dark eyes that were fixed right on me. They looked intelligent. Too intelligent for an animal. There was recognition there, like it was just as surprised to see me as I was to see it. Its face was flat and broad, not quite human, but definitely not like any animal I knew. For what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds, we just stared at each other. It didn't make any sound, no growl or roar. It didn't move toward me or make any threatening gesture. It just watched. I'd like to say I was brave, that I stood my ground or tried to communicate with it somehow, but that would be a lie. Pure animal instinct kicked in, and I ran. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, not even in the direction of the Hendersons' place, just away. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might burst right out of my chest. I didn't stop until I reached home, burst through the door and slammed it behind me. My mother was in the kitchen and looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Sweating, panting, unable to form a coherent sentence for several minutes. "What on earth happened to you?" she asked. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but the words sounded ridiculous coming out of my mouth. A giant, hairy man in the woods. Even I was starting to doubt what I'd seen. My mother looked concerned, but chalked it up to an overactive imagination. Maybe a large black bear that I'd misidentified in the shadows. "You know how the light plays tricks in those woods," she said, handing me a glass of water. "Probably just some fella hunting, or maybe one of those university students doing research." I nodded and tried to convince myself she was right, but I knew better. What I'd seen wasn't human, and it wasn't any animal native to Florida. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound outside my window made me jump. The wind in the trees, a branch scraping against the house, an owl hooting. Everything became sinister. The next day passed uneventfully, and I started to think maybe my mother was right. Maybe the heat and exhaustion had played tricks on my mind. I avoided talking about it, embarrassed by my reaction. I didn't go back near those woods, though. I took the long way around to get anywhere I needed to go. That evening, it was around 7 o'clock, still light outside in the summer. I was sitting in the living room reading a magazine when I heard my mother scream. Not just a startled yelp, but a full-throated scream of terror. I jumped up and ran to her bedroom, finding her backed against the far wall, pointing at the window. "Someone's out there!" she shrieked. "Someone was looking in at me. Now you have to understand something about our house. It was built on a slight incline, and the windows in my mother's room were a good 7 feet off the ground outside. No normal-sized person could possibly look in without a ladder." I rushed to the window and peered out. At first, I saw nothing but the darkening woods beyond our yard. Then I caught movement, something large disappearing into the tree line about 50 yards away, something that moved on 2 legs, but definitely wasn't a person. My mother was shaking, her face pale. "Did you see it? Did you see it?" she kept asking. I lied. I told her I didn't see anything, that it was probably just someone passing by. But I knew. I knew it was the same creature I'd seen the day before, and now it had come looking for me. It had followed me home. "What did it look like?" I asked her, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know," she said, her voice trembling. "It was big. So big. And its face." She shook her head. It wasn't right. The face wasn't right. And the eyes, those awful eyes just staring in at me. I made her some tea and tried to calm her down. Eventually, she convinced herself it must have been someone standing on something to peek in. Maybe some kids playing a prank. But I could tell she didn't really believe that. Something about what she'd seen had shaken her to her core. That night, I grabbed my father's old shotgun from the closet and loaded it. I'd never fired it before, but having it near me provided some small comfort. Every noise had me on edge. Sleep was impossible. Around 3 in the morning, I heard it, a deep, rumbling sound from outside. Not quite a growl, but similar. Then, heavy footsteps circling the house. Slow, deliberate steps that no human would make. Thud, 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 moving around the perimeter. I sat frozen in my bed, the shotgun clutched in my sweaty hands, afraid to even breathe. The footsteps stopped outside my window. I could hear breathing now, deep, rhythmic breathing. Then a smell seeped in through the closed window. A wild, musky odor, unlike anything I'd ever smelled before. Something scraped against the side of the house, and the window frame creaked slightly, as if under pressure. Was it trying to get in? I raised the shotgun, aiming at the window, my finger trembling near the trigger. Minutes passed like hours. Finally, the breathing moved away, and the footsteps receded into the distance. I didn't move until morning light filtered through my window. Only then did I dare to go outside. What I found made my blood run cold. Around the entire house, massive footprints had been pressed into the soft ground. They were at least 16 inches long and incredibly wide, with 5 distinct toes. No bear, no human, no known animal could have made those prints. Even more disturbing, under my window and my mother's, the ground had been disturbed as if something had stood there for a long time, shifting its weight back and forth. Small branches from nearby trees had been broken off about 8 feet up, as if something tall had pushed through. My mother saw the tracks too. She didn't say much, just stared at them with this vacant look in her eyes, before going back inside to call my uncle. He came over that afternoon with his friend who worked for the sheriff's department. They examined the prints, took some measurements, and exchanged looks I couldn't interpret. The deputy said something about a bear standing on its hind legs, but I could tell he didn't believe that any more than we did. They filled in the prints and told us to keep the doors locked, promising to patrol the area more frequently. For the next week we lived in fear. Every night we'd hear those same heavy footsteps circling the house. Sometimes branches would snap in the woods, or we'd hear that deep chest rumbling sound that wasn't quite a growl. The smell would come to dash, that wild, musky odor that seemed to seep through closed windows and doors. My mother wanted to leave, to go stay with her sister in Jacksonville, but something kept me there. Curiosity, maybe, or some primitive need to defend our territory. I don't know. On the 6th night, I decided I'd had enough. When the footsteps began their nightly circuit around the house, I grabbed the shotgun and a flashlight and stepped onto the back porch. My mother begged me not to go out, but I was 18 and thought I was invincible. The night was thick with humidity. The air so heavy, it felt like breathing through a wet cloth. Cicadas and frogs created a wall of sound, but they went suddenly silent as I stepped off the porch. I played the flashlight beam along the edge of the woods, the light barely penetrating the dense foliage. For several minutes I saw nothing. Then the beam caught something that made my heart stop. Eyes. 2 large, reflective eyes about 8 feet off the ground, staring back at me from between the trees. Not the red reflection you get from a deer or raccoon, but a deep yellowish glow, and they were set too wide apart to be human. "What do you want?" I shouted, raising the shotgun. My voice sounded small and pathetic in the vast darkness. The eyes blinked once, slowly. Then from the darkness came a sound I'll never forget, not a roar or a scream, but a long, low vocalization that started deep and rose in pitch. It wasn't threatening exactly, more like communication. I stood frozen as the sound washed over me. When it stopped, the eyes remained, watching me. Slowly, deliberately, a massive shape began to emerge from the tree line. In the dim light, I could make out the broad shoulders, the massive height, the thick hair covering its body. It took one step forward, then another. It was now at the edge of our yard, about 30 feet away. close enough that the flashlight illuminated its entire form. It was exactly as I'd seen that first day, but so much more terrifying up close. Muscles rippled under that thick coat of hair as it moved. Its hands, because they were hands, not paws, hung at its sides. Massive things with opposable thumbs. I should have fired the shotgun, I should have run, but I did neither. Something in those eyes held me in place. An intelligence, a curiosity that mirrored my own. For a moment, just a moment, I didn't feel afraid. Then it made that sound again, that rising vocalization, and took another step toward me. That broke the spell. I fired the shotgun into the air, the blast shattering the night silence. The creature flinched but didn't run. Instead, it raised one massive hand, not in a threatening way, but almost like it was trying to communicate something. I fired again, this time aiming just to the side of it. That did it. The creature turned and moved back into the forest, not running in panic but walking with purpose, occasionally looking back at me over its massive shoulder. My mother was hysterical when I came back inside, having heard the shotgun blasts. Neighbors called, lights came on in distant houses. I told everyone I'd fired at what I thought was a bear. No one questioned it too closely. That was the last time we saw or heard the creature. The footsteps never returned. The strange smells faded. Life gradually returned to normal. We moved away from Gainesville the following year. My mother never spoke about what happened, but sometimes I'd catch her staring out windows with a wary expression, especially at dusk. I've read about Bigfoot sightings since then, looked at sketchy photos and blurry videos. None of them capture what I saw that summer. None of them convey the intelligence in those eyes or the deliberate way it moved. I don't know what it was or what it wanted, why it followed me home, why it watched us, why it left. But I know what I saw. And sometimes, even now, when I'm in a wooded area and the light starts to fade, I get that feeling again. That I'm being watched by something that stands just inside the tree line, waiting. Story 4. I still can't shake what happened last week. I've been living in rural Pennsylvania for nearly 3 years now, and I've always loved the isolation. My little house sits on about 2 acres, with cornfields stretching out on one side and dense forest on the other. It's the perfect place for my 2 dogs. Max, a German Shepherd mix, and Cooper, a black lab, to run around and burn off energy. Last Tuesday was completely normal at first. It was warm and sunny around 4 in the afternoon, and I decided to take the dogs for their usual walk. We do this route almost every day, across the road from my house, through Mr. Peterson's cornfield. He's fine with locals walking through as long as we stick to the tractor paths. And then to the edge of the forest where there's a nice little trail. Max and Cooper know the route by heart and usually run ahead of me, always stopping at the tree line to wait for my permission to go further. The corn was high, about 7 feet tall, creating these perfect corridors between rows. The sun was beating down, and I remember thinking how peaceful it all felt. Birds were chirping. There was a light breeze and the dogs were having a blast, running back and forth through the paths. When we reached the forest edge, everything seemed normal at first. Max and Cooper were sniffing around as usual, tails wagging. I stopped to check a text message on my phone, and when I looked up, the dogs were already trotting into the forest, which was fine. They always stayed within sight. But then something happened that I've never seen before. Both dogs suddenly froze. Their ears perked up, and they became completely still. I called out to them, thinking maybe they'd spotted a deer or something. Instead of continuing forward or coming back to me, they both turned and bolted back toward me. I've never seen them move so fast. Cooper was actually whimpering as he ran, a sound I'd never heard him make before. Max, who's usually the brave one, was tucked tail and running like his life depended on it. When they reached me, they pressed against my legs, trembling and making these awful crying sounds. My first thought was snake, but their reaction seemed too extreme for that. I looked toward the forest, scanning the tree line, trying to figure out what had scared them so badly. That's when I saw it. About 50 yards into the trees, partially obscured by the foliage but clearly visible, was something. At first, my brain tried to process it as a person, maybe a hunter in a ghillie suit, but no. This thing was massive, at least 8 feet tall. It was standing upright like a human, but the proportions were all wrong. Its arms hung down almost to its knees, and its entire body was covered in dark, matted hair or fur. The face is what I remember most clearly. It wasn't hidden or turned away. It was looking directly at us. The features were wrong. Not quite human, not quite animal. Its face was flat and wide with deep-set eyes that I swear to God were intelligent. The nose was broad and flat, and its jaw jutted out unnaturally. I stood there, frozen for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. The thing didn't move. It just watched us. There was something so deliberate about its stillness that made it 1,000 times more terrifying than if it had charged at us. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely clip the leashes onto the dog's collars. Max was still whining, pressing himself against me so hard I almost lost my balance. Cooper had gone completely silent, which was unusual for him, and his whole body was rigid. I didn't run immediately. Something about the situation made me feel like running would be the worst thing I could do. Instead, I slowly started backing away, keeping my eyes on the creature. It still didn't move, but I swear its head turned slightly to follow our movement. When we were about 20 feet back into the cornfield, with the creature no longer in sight, something in me snapped. I turned and ran, dragging the dogs with me. They didn't need any encouragement. They were pulling me along just as much as I was pulling them. The corn rows, which had felt so peaceful earlier, now felt like a maze. The stalks seemed to close in around us, and every rustle made my heart jump into my throat. I kept imagining that thing crashing through the corn behind us, those long arms reaching out. When we finally burst out onto the road, I was gasping for air. My shirt was soaked with sweat, and my legs felt like jelly. I didn't slow down until we were back across the road and in my yard, and even then, I ran straight into the house and locked the door. The dogs wouldn't leave my side for the rest of the day. That night, they slept pressed up against me instead of in their usual spots at the foot of the bed. Every sound from outside made them perk up and whine. I tried to convince myself it was just a bear standing on its hind legs. That had to be it, right? But bears don't stand that tall, and they don't just watch you like that. And I've seen bears startle my dogs before. They bark and get excited. They don't tuck tail and run in terror. The next morning, I was taking out the trash when I ran into my neighbor Tom, who lives about half a mile down the road. He mentioned that he'd been hearing strange noises the past few nights, like wood knocking and these weird, almost human-sounding howls. He thought maybe some teenagers were messing around in the woods, but now I'm not so sure. What's really freaking me out is the dogs. They've changed since that day. They refuse to go into the backyard without me, and even then, they stay close to the house. At night, they'll sometimes start barking frantically at the forest side of the property, hackles raised, but there's never anything visible. Cooper has started sleeping under my bed instead of on it, and Max paces the house at night, checking the windows. 2 nights ago, around 2 in the morning, both dogs suddenly went crazy, barking and growling at the back door. I turned on the floodlights but couldn't see anything. When I went to calm them down, Max was trembling so hard, I thought he was having a seizure. Whatever they sensed, it terrified them. Yesterday I went back to the forest edge in my car, parking on the road and using binoculars to scan the area where we saw the thing. I didn't get out. Couldn't make myself do it. I didn't see anything unusual, but the feeling of being watched was so intense I could barely stand it. I left after only a few minutes. I've been researching online, trying to find explanations. I've gone down the rabbit hole of Bigfoot and Sasquatch sightings, and some of the descriptions match what I saw. I've never been one to believe in cryptids or monsters, but I know what I saw wasn't normal. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a person in a costume who would even do that out here. and it definitely wasn't my imagination. There are local stories I've discovered, old tales about the woodman or the forest guardian that date back to the original settlers and the Native American tribes before them. I used to think they were just campfire stories, but now I'm not so sure. I haven't told many people about this. Who would believe me? Hey, I saw Bigfoot in my neighbor's cornfield in broad daylight. Isn't exactly something you can casually bring up in conversation. The few friends I've tried to tell have given me that look. You know the one. Like I'm either lying or losing my mind. But I know what I saw. And my dogs know what they saw. Every morning when I let them out, they stand at the edge of the yard, staring toward that cornfield and the forest beyond. And they growl. They never did that before. I installed security cameras around the house yesterday, probably an overreaction. But I can't shake the feeling that it knows where I live now, that it followed us home somehow. I keep the blinds closed at night now, and I've started keeping a baseball bat by my bed. The thing that keeps me up at night isn't just the memory of what I saw. It's the feeling I got when it looked at me. There was intelligence there, purpose. It wasn't just a wild animal reacting on instinct. It was thinking, analyzing, deciding, and for whatever reason, it decided to let us go. I still have to walk the dogs, but we stick to the neighborhood streets now. No more cornfields, definitely no more forests. Even so, I catch myself constantly looking over my shoulder, scanning the tree line in the distance. The dogs do the same thing. I drive by that cornfield every day on my way to work, and every time I can't help but slow down and look. The corn will be harvested soon, and I wonder if it's still out there, watching from the forest edge, waiting. For what? I don't know. Sometimes, in the dead of night when the house is completely silent, I swear I can hear wood knocking in the distance, just like Tom described. 3 distinct knocks, then silence. A response comes several minutes later from a different direction. Knock, knock, knock. The dogs hear it too. Their heads snap up, ears forward, eyes wide with fear. They don't bark at that sound, which is almost more disturbing than when they do. I don't know what to do. Move. That seems extreme. Call the police and tell them what exactly? That I saw a Sasquatch? They'd laugh me out of town. Set up trail cameras in the forest? I'm not sure I want proof. I'm not sure I want to know if it's still there, watching, waiting. All I know is that my dogs haven't been the same since. I haven't been the same. That feeling of being watched hasn't gone away. And every time the sun starts to set, I make sure the doors are locked, the curtains are drawn, and the baseball bat is within reach. Because whatever that thing was, it wasn't natural. It wasn't supposed to be there. And the way it looked at me, I can't shake the feeling that this isn't over. Atun, Story 5. I still can't really talk about that day without getting goosebumps all over. I've tried telling a few close friends, but the looks they give me, well, you know how it goes. But here, I figure people might actually believe me. It was August 19th, 1970. I remember the exact date because it was my cousin's birthday, and I'd been planning to drive up to Portland that evening to meet him for dinner. I had plenty of time, so I decided to take the scenic route through Beacon Rock State Park in Skamania County. It was a beautiful summer day in Washington, one of those rare, perfect ones where it's not too hot, not too cold. I was driving my old Ford pickup. Nothing fancy, just a reliable workhorse that had never given me any trouble. The windows were down, radio playing some CCR, and I was enjoying the drive through the towering trees. The park was pretty quiet that day. I'd passed maybe 2 other cars in the last half hour. About halfway through the park, I heard this weird scraping noise coming from the passenger side of the truck. It sounded exactly like a flat tire. That unmistakable flap, flap, flap of rubber against pavement. I remember sighing and thinking, great, just what I need today. I slowed down, pulled over onto this little gravelly shoulder area and cut the engine. When I stepped out, the first thing that hit me was the silence. The radio was off now, and there were no other cars around. just the soft whisper of wind through the trees and some distant birds. I walked around to check the passenger side tire, but it looked completely fine. No flat, no obvious damage. I checked all the others too. Nothing wrong that I could see. I remember standing there, hands on my hips, completely confused. The sound had been so clear, so distinct. I even knelt down to feel the tires with my hands, thinking maybe there was a slow leak or something embedded in the rubber I couldn't see. That's when it happened. This feeling washed over me. It's hard to explain if you've never felt it, but it was like every cell in my body suddenly went on high alert. The hair on the back of my neck stood straight up. My skin prickled all over. It was this overwhelming sense that I was being watched, not just casually observed, but intensely studied. I slowly straightened up, and something made me look toward the tree line about 30 yards away. At first I couldn't process what I was seeing. My brain just couldn't make sense of it. There, partially obscured by the lower branches of a massive Douglas fir, was something huge. As my eyes focused, I realized I was looking at some kind of creature standing upright among the trees. But the scale was all wrong. Way, way wrong. This thing was enormous. I'm talking 10 to 12 feet tall at least. And it wasn't just tall, it was massive in build. The shoulders on this thing were incredibly wide, like a linebacker times 3. The strangest part was its head seemed to sit directly on those shoulders. There wasn't really a neck, or if there was, it was so thick and muscular you couldn't distinguish it from the shoulders. The whole thing was covered in this shaggy coconut brown hair or fur. Not black like you hear in most stories, but definitely brown, kind of like the color of an old coconut husk. The hair on its body looked to be about 3 to 4 inches long, but on its head it was shorter, maybe 2 inches, and uneven, like it had been roughly cut or worn down. I remember thinking how strange that detail was, even in the moment. Its face. God, its face. I can still see it so clearly. The skin was a grayish-brown, darker than human skin. It had this protruding chin and a receding forehead that sloped back sharply. The nose was wide and flat, with these massive nostrils that seemed to flare slightly as it breathed. And its teeth, I could see them because its mouth was partially open, large, square, and startlingly white. Almost unnaturally white against the darkness of its face. But the eyes, Jesus, the eyes are what I remember most. They were this amber color, not yellow, not brown, but amber like honey held up to sunlight, and they seemed to have this faint glow to them, even in broad daylight. I know that sounds impossible, but I swear that's what I saw, and they were fixed directly on me, not looking near me or around me, looking at me, into me almost. I couldn't move. I literally could not make my body respond for several seconds. It wasn't just fear, though there was plenty of that. It was like my brain had short-circuited trying to process what I was seeing. This thing shouldn't exist. It couldn't exist. Yet there it was, as real as the truck behind me. The weird thing is, it didn't seem aggressive. It wasn't making threatening moves or sounds. It was just watching me, studying me with what almost seemed like curiosity. But there was an intelligence behind those eyes that was unmistakable. This wasn't an animal operating on instinct. There was something thinking behind that gaze. We must have stared at each other for maybe 15 seconds, though it felt like hours. Then it shifted its weight slightly, and I heard the crack of a branch under its foot. The sound broke whatever spell had fallen over me, and I felt my heart suddenly hammering in my chest like it was trying to break through my ribs. I remember opening my mouth, but no sound came out. What do you say when confronted with something that shatters your entire understanding of the world? Hello, what are you? I just stood there, my mouth working uselessly. The creature took a step backward, still maintaining eye contact with me. Its movement was surprisingly smooth and deliberate, not the awkward shambling you might expect from something so large. It moved with purpose and control. As it stepped back, I could see its full height more clearly, and I remember thinking that if it had wanted to, it could have covered the distance between us in maybe 3 or 4 strides. Then it simply turned and moved deeper into the forest. It didn't run or crash through the underbrush. It just walked away with these long, fluid strides. The vegetation seemed to part around it, and within seconds it had disappeared completely into the trees. The last thing I saw was that brown fur vanishing behind a large cedar. I don't know how long I stood there after it was gone. My legs felt weak, like I might collapse at any moment. I remember becoming aware of the sounds of the forest again, birds calling, the wind in the trees. Sounds that had been completely absent during our encounter, I realized. It was like nature itself had held its breath while this thing was present. When I finally managed to move, I practically dove back into my truck. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I remember the relief that washed over me at that sound. Something normal, something from my world that made sense. I pulled back onto the road and drove way too fast through the rest of the park. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see that massive figure step out onto the road behind me. My mind was racing, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. A bear standing on its hind legs. No, bears don't stand that tall or move that way. A man in a costume. The movements were too natural, the proportions too impossible to fake. What I'd seen was something else entirely. I didn't go to Portland that night. I called my cousin from a payphone at a gas station and made up some story about the truck having trouble. I couldn't face sitting across from someone, trying to act normal, while my entire worldview had just been turned inside out. When I got home, I sat in my living room with all the lights on until dawn. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those amber eyes staring back at me. The next day, I almost convinced myself it had been some kind of hallucination. Maybe I'd been working too hard. Maybe it was stress. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real. Every detail was too vivid, too specific to be something my mind had invented. I read everything I could find about similar sightings after that. Most descriptions matched parts of what I'd seen, but never completely. The height, the color of the fur, those haunting eyes. These weren't details you'd find in every account. This was something I had experienced firsthand. I never told any authorities. What would I say? Who would believe me? A few times over the years, I've driven back through that same stretch of park, always with this knot of dread and anticipation in my stomach. But I've never seen it again. It's been decades now since that day, but I can still recall every detail with perfect clarity. The way the light filtered through the trees, the smell of pine and earth in the air, the complete, unnatural silence, and those eyes, intelligent, aware, studying me as carefully as I was studying it. I don't know what I encountered that day in Beacon Rock State Park, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, some unknown species of primate. The label doesn't really matter. What matters is that it exists. It's out there. I saw it with my own eyes, and nothing anyone says can convince me otherwise. Sometimes when I'm alone in the woods, even just on a casual hike, I'll get that feeling again, that prickling awareness of being watched. And I'll wonder if it's out there, watching from the trees, remembering our encounter just as vividly as I do. I've never felt threatened by the memory. Shaken, sure. Fundamentally changed, absolutely, but not threatened. Whatever this creature is, it had every opportunity to harm me that day if it had wanted to. Instead, it simply observed and moved on. Sometimes I think that's the most unsettling part of all, the clear intelligence and restraint it displayed. I'm an old man now, and I've never seen anything like it again, but I know what I saw, and sometimes in my dreams, those amber eyes still find me. Story 6. I still can't sleep right when I think about what happened last September. My brother Jake and I had been planning our fishing trip to the Kenai for months. Just a simple weekend getaway to catch some salmon and have some beers without our wives or kids nagging us. It was supposed to be relaxing. We'd spent all day fishing on the 25th, caught a few decent silvers, nothing spectacular. We were tired but didn't want to waste money on a hotel when we planned to be back on the river early the next morning. Around 11:30 at night, we were driving south of Soldotna on the Kenai Peninsula Highway when I spotted this gravel pull-off area truckers and hunters use sometimes. "Let's just crash here for a few hours," I told Jake. "We can sleep in the Suburban or set up the chairs outside if it stays warm." Jake nodded, already half asleep in the passenger seat. "Whatever, man, I'm beat." I pulled our dusty old Suburban onto the gravel, positioning it so the headlights faced the forest. We'd been driving with the windows down earlier, so the vehicle was covered in that fine Alaska road dust that gets into everything. When I killed the engine, the silence hit immediately. It was that deep quiet you only get in places far from towns. We hauled out our folding chairs, set up a small Coleman lantern on the cooler between us, and broke out some sandwiches my wife had packed. The night air was cool but not uncomfortable, maybe mid-40s. You could see stars between the trees, and the moon was just a sliver. We'd been sitting there for maybe 15 minutes, just bullshitting about the day's fishing, when I noticed something weird. There had been frogs croaking in the sloughs nearby. That background noise you don't really pay attention to until it stops, and it had stopped, completely. I felt this crawling sensation start at the base of my spine. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the tree line. "You hear that?" I asked Jake, keeping my voice low. "Hear what?" "Exactly. Everything just went quiet." Jake laughed it off, taking another bite of his sandwich. "You've been watching too many horror movies, bro." But I noticed his eyes scanning the trees too. Later, he admitted he'd felt the same thing I did, like we were suddenly prey. The forest edge was maybe 30 feet from where we'd parked. Our lantern created this small bubble of yellow light, but beyond that was just darkness. The trees looked like black cutouts against the slightly lighter night sky. Then around midnight, we heard it, a single heavy footfall in the forest. Not a deer or a moose. I've hunted enough to know the difference. This was a deliberate step, followed by another slower one, like something big trying to move quietly, but failing. The sound of branches cracking followed, not the random snap of wind, but the methodical breaking that happens when something large pushes through undergrowth. Jake and I both stood up at the same time. He grabbed the lantern and held it higher, but the light barely reached the first row of trees. "Hello?" he called out. "Anyone there?" No answer, just more cracking branches. The sound circled around to our left, faded away, then suddenly resumed from another angle, now behind us, closer to the road. "Bear?" Jake whispered. I shook my head. Bears don't circle like that. They either approach or they don't. We both scanned the tree line, turning in place to follow the sounds as they moved. The footfalls were heavier now, more confident somehow. Whatever it was had completed a full circle around our little camp and was now directly in front of us again, just inside the forest's edge. That's when it happened. Without any warning, something massive broke from the trees. I'm not talking about someone emerging. I'm talking about a shape so big it seemed to tear through the darkness itself. It covered the 30 feet between the forest and our vehicle in what seemed like 2 strides. An enormous hand. I can't even call it a hand, more like a massive paw covered in shaggy hair, came down on the hood of my Suburban with a flat, explosive smack that echoed through the trees. The metal rang out like someone had hit a drum, and the entire vehicle rocked backward on its suspension. My coffee mug, which I'd set on the hood, went flying. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the cooler, knocking my chair over in the process. In that moment, I got my only clear look at it in the lantern's glow. It was standing upright, not hunched over like a bear, but straight up like a man. only it wasn't a man. It was massive, towering, with arms so long the hands would have hung past its knees. Dark hair hung from its body in clumps, like it was wet or matted. Its shoulders were wider than a bull moose's, enormous and rounded with muscle. The head rose to a slight peak, not perfectly round. The face. God. The face is what I still see when I close my eyes. It was broad, mostly shadowed, but I could make out the eyes catching the lantern light, reflecting back with a faint reddish tinge. Not glowing red like in stories, but that reflection you see sometimes with animals at night. The thing let out this deep, chesty exhale, not quite a growl, more like the sound you'd make after lifting something heavy. Then it stepped back, its form melting into the darkness beyond our light. "Get in the truck!" Jake yelled, already scrambling backward. I don't even remember running. 1 second I was frozen in place, the next I was yanking open the driver's side door. Jake practically dove into the passenger seat, still clutching the lantern. We could hear it moving around the vehicle, heavy footsteps circling us, breaking branches as it moved between the Suburban and the forest. I fumbled with the keys, dropping them once before jamming them into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I hit the headlights. That's when we caught another glimpse of it moving between trees at the edge of the forest, just for a second before it disappeared deeper into the woods. Even in that brief moment, I could see it was striding with this deliberate power, arms swinging low at its sides, heading away from us, but not running, more like retreating on its terms. I threw the Suburban into reverse, spun us around, and floored it back onto the highway. I didn't slow down until we were at least 20 miles away. We pulled over at a well-lit gas station near Sterling. Both of us were shaking, pale-faced, neither of us having said a word the entire drive. Jake finally broke the silence. What the actual fuck was that? I shook my head. I don't know, man. I don't know. In the harsh fluorescent lights of the gas station, we tried to process what we'd seen. The thing had been well over 8 feet tall. I'm 6'2", and it towered over me. Its shoulders were wider than the hood of my truck, and its arms looked thick as fence posts. The hair had appeared dark brown to almost black, wet-looking and matted, with what seemed like lighter streaks on the forearms. The head had that tapered-up look, with a pronounced brow ridge, and there was very little visible neck. It looked like its head sat directly on those massive shoulders. When dawn broke, we examined the hood of the Suburban. There was a faint palm shape where the dust had been swept aside, with 5 finger marks trailing down. You could see shallow dents where the metal had actually bowed under the impact. Jake put his hand next to the print. The thing's hand had nearly doubled the span of his. The strangest part of the whole encounter was that it didn't try to attack us or open the vehicle. It just hit the hood hard, like it was making a point. Like it was saying, "This is my territory. Get out." I sold that Suburban a few months later, couldn't stand looking at the hood every day. But Jake, my crazy brother, he actually kept the hood when I scrapped the truck, has it hanging in his garage like a trophy or something. Says it's his proof, though the handprint has long since faded. We've told this story to a few people. Most think we're bullshitting or that we saw a bear, but we know what bears look like. This wasn't a bear. The rangers we reported it to just nodded politely and filed some report that's probably gathering dust somewhere. I still go fishing on the Kenai, but I don't drive that highway at night anymore if I can help it. And I sure as hell don't pull over to sleep on random gravel turnouts. Jake says I'm being paranoid, but I notice he doesn't do solo trips up there anymore either. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else has seen it there, if anyone else has had that moment of pure primal terror when you realize you're not at the top of the food chain, when you understand what it means to be sized up by something bigger and stronger than you'll ever be. I don't know what we encountered that night, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, some undiscovered species, but I know it was intelligent. It knew exactly what it was doing. It wasn't just some animal reacting on instinct. It deliberately circled us, studied us, then made a calculated display of power before disappearing back into its domain. That's what keeps me up at night. Not just that these things exist, but that they're smart, that they've been watching us all along, staying just out of sight, letting us believe we're alone in the wilderness. I've spent my whole life in Alaska, and I used to think I understood the wild. Now I know better. Now I know there are things out there that don't want to be found, things that will warn you once to stay away, and might not be so gentle the second time. Story 7. I've kept this bottled up for too long. Even after all these years, I still get chills thinking about that day. I need to finally share what happened to me on August 12th, 1971. I know how this sounds, believe me, but every word is true. I was working as a rabies control officer for Broward County back then. Mainly I dealt with stray dogs, raccoons, the occasional fox. Pretty routine stuff. Nothing in my training prepared me for what I encountered that day. It started with a call around 2 in the afternoon. The dispatcher told me residents at Kings Manor Estates trailer park were reporting something large and hairy, scaring their kids. The trailer park was west of Fort Lauderdale in Davie, a rural area back then with lots of undeveloped land around it. My first thought was it was probably just a black bear. Florida had them, though they weren't common in Broward County. Still, it seemed the most logical explanation. I grabbed my gear, catch pole, tranquilizer kit, camera, and headed out in my county-issued truck. It was brutally hot and humid that day, even by South Florida standards. I remember my uniform was already soaked with sweat by the time I arrived. The air conditioner in that old truck never worked right. When I pulled into the trailer park around 2:30, something felt off immediately. Usually when I responded to animal calls, I'd find folks gathered outside, pointing toward where they'd seen whatever critter was causing problems. But Kings Manor was eerily quiet. I saw curtains moving in windows, but hardly anyone was outside, despite it being summer vacation time, when kids would normally be playing everywhere. I drove slowly through the park, making my way down the main road. The silence was unnerving. I remember checking my watch, it was 2:45, and wondering if I'd somehow gotten the wrong address. That's when I saw it. About 50 yards ahead, something stepped out from between 2 trailers and began crossing the street. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was looking at. It was tall, well over 6 feet, and walked in a strange, lumbering gait. What struck me immediately were its arms. They were incredibly long, swinging down to its knees as it moved. I hit the brakes and just stared. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The creature stopped in the middle of the road and turned toward my truck. That's when I got a clear look at its face. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. The face was flat and monkey-like, with a wide, low forehead and small, deep-set eyes. They weren't animal eyes. There was something disturbingly intelligent in them. Its entire body was covered in hair, mostly a dark brown color, but with these weird gray splotches across its torso and limbs. The pattern wasn't like any animal I'd ever documented or studied. It wasn't matted or dirty like you'd expect from a wild animal. It looked almost groomed. I sat frozen in my truck, unable to move. The creature and I just stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. It showed no fear. That's what really got to me. Most wild animals bolt when they see humans, especially in vehicles. This thing just observed me calmly, like it was assessing me. Then it did something that still haunts me. It tilted its head slightly, almost like it was curious about me. That small, human-like gesture sent ice through my veins. After that moment, it simply continued across the road. That's when I noticed its strange gait more clearly. It wasn't walking fully upright like a person. It was using the backs of its fingers to support some of its weight, knuckle walking like you'd see in gorillas or chimps, but still much more erect than those animals typically move. It disappeared into the trees beyond the trailer park. I sat there for several minutes, trying to process what I'd seen. My training kicked in, and I grabbed my camera from the passenger seat. I needed evidence. I got out of the truck, my legs shaking so badly I nearly fell. The humidity hit me like a wall, but I barely noticed. I was running on pure adrenaline. I walked to where the creature had crossed, scanning the ground. The soil was soft from recent rain, and there they were. Footprints unlike anything I'd ever seen. They were deep, whatever made them was heavy, and about 14 inches long. What really stood out were the knuckle impressions between them, confirming the strange walking style I'd observed. I took several photos, using my pen for scale. My hands were trembling so badly, some of the pictures came out blurry. As I was documenting the prints, I heard a door slam. A middle-aged man in a tank top approached me, carrying a shotgun. His name was Bill, he told me, and he lived in the trailer nearest to where I was parked. "You've seen it too, haven't you?" he asked, his voice tight with fear. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak yet. "It's been around for 3 days now," Bill said. "My grandkids won't even go outside anymore. First night we heard it, thought it was just raccoons in the trash. Then my grandson said he saw a monkey man watching him from the woods while he was on the swings. We laughed it off until I saw the damn thing myself yesterday evening, standing right where you're standing now." As we talked, more residents emerged from their homes. An elderly woman told me she'd seen it looking in her bedroom window 2 nights ago. A teenage boy claimed it had followed him home from his friend's trailer after dark. A couple with a young daughter said they'd found strange hair caught on their chain-link fence. By 4 o'clock, I had a crowd around me. Some people were panicking, running around with shotguns and rifles. Others were keeping their kids close, eyeing the tree line nervously. Everyone had a story, and they all described the same thing. Big, hairy, with that distinctive monkey-like face darting through the woods around the trailer park. I called my supervisor from the payphone by the park office. He thought I was making it up, or that the residents had mass hysteria. He told me to take statements, file a report, and leave it at that. He wasn't sending backup for some guy in a monkey suit. I spent the next several hours interviewing witnesses and taking notes. Some accounts were clearly exaggerated. One man claimed it was 9 feet tall and had glowing eyes. But the core descriptions matched what I'd seen. 6 to 7 feet tall, long arms, brown hair with grey patches, knuckle walking. Around 6:30, as the sun was starting to get low, I decided to check the wooded area where the creature had disappeared. Looking back, this was incredibly stupid. I had no weapon apart from my tranquilizer gun, which would have been useless against something that size unless I got a perfect shot. I followed a narrow path into the trees. The light was fading fast, filtered through the dense canopy. I heard the normal sounds of Florida wildlife, birds, insects, the occasional splash from the nearby canal, but something felt wrong. Everything seemed too quiet in spots, like the animals were avoiding certain areas. About 200 yards in, I found more footprints. Fresher this time, they led to a small clearing where the vegetation was crushed down in a circular pattern. It looked like something had been resting there. I took more photos and collected what appeared to be hair samples from a low-hanging branch. That's when I felt it, the sensation of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I scanned the tree line slowly and saw nothing, but the feeling persisted. I've worked with wild animals my whole life, and I've developed a sort of sixth sense about their presence. This was different, more calculating. I started backing away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. There was a crack of a branch breaking somewhere to my left. I turned and ran. I made it back to the trailer park just as darkness was falling. Several residents had formed a makeshift patrol, armed with whatever weapons they had. They planned to keep watch through the night. I advised against confronting the creature if they saw it. Just document and call the authorities. By the time I left around 8 that evening, I had pages of notes, several rolls of film with photographs of prints, and statements from at least 15 eyewitnesses. The evidence was undeniable. There was something out there, not a bear, not a known primate, but something unknown that was powerful, seemingly intelligent, and had made the trailer park its territory. I filed my report the next day, including the photos I'd developed overnight. My supervisor glanced at it, laughed, and filed it away. "Congratulations," he said. "You found Florida's Bigfoot." I went back to the trailer park several times over the next few weeks. There were more sightings, more tracks. I interviewed more witnesses. I spent my days off searching the surrounding wetlands and wooded areas. I never found a body or a nest or any conclusive proof that would convince the skeptics. But I know what I saw. The creature seemed to disappear about a month after my initial encounter. The sightings stopped, the residents relaxed, and life at King's Manor returned to normal. My report was buried in some county filing cabinet, probably thrown out years ago during a purge of old records. Sometimes I drive by that area now. It's all developed. Shopping centers, housing developments, paved roads everywhere. The wild spaces where that creature lived are gone. I wonder where it went, or if it was the last of its kind. I've spent 50 years trying to make sense of what I saw that August afternoon. Was it some unknown species of primate, an escaped exotic pet that had grown to adulthood in the Florida wilderness? Something else entirely? All I know for certain is what I witnessed. A large, knuckle-walking creature with long arms and that strange gray splotched hair. I remember those small, intelligent eyes studying me. I remember the deliberate way it moved, unafraid, confident in its strength. And sometimes, when I'm falling asleep, I still feel that sensation of being watched from the darkness. And I wonder if it's still out there somewhere, watching and waiting. Story 8. I still can't believe what happened that evening back in '96. It's been decades now, but I remember every detail, like it was yesterday. I've never really shared this with many people because, well, you know how it goes when someone mentions anything about a Sasquatch or Bigfoot. The looks, the whispers, the sure buddy whatever you say, comments. But this is exactly what happened to me, and I swear on everything I hold dear that it's true. I had just moved to this little cabin outside Helena that summer. Nothing fancy, just a simple place on about 5 acres of land. Most of it was open field, but there were these patches of woods along the edges of the property. I loved it immediately. After years of apartment living, having all this space felt like freedom. One of the first things I did was put in a vegetable garden. Tomatoes, zucchinis, peppers, basic stuff that wasn't too hard to grow. I spent most evenings out there just tending to my plants, enjoying the quiet. That particular evening in late July, I remember it was warm but not hot. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, but there was still plenty of light to see by. That bluish twilight that hangs around forever during Montana summers. Must have been around 8:30 or so. I was on my knees pulling weeds from around my tomato plants with my 2 dogs, a lab mix and a border collie, lounging on the porch about 30 yards away. They were tired from running around all day, just watching me lazily from the distance. I'd just finished watering the tomatoes when I heard it, something heavy moving through the underbrush at the edge of the woods. At first I figured it was probably a deer. We got them all the time, and they loved to come out at dusk. I straightened up to look, expecting to shoo away a doe or maybe even a young buck. What I saw instead made my blood freeze. Standing there, maybe 20 yards away, just beyond my garden fence, was something else entirely. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, probably more. It stood completely upright on 2 legs, covered in this uneven dark brown hair that looked matted in some places and shaggier in others. It had these incredibly broad shoulders that tapered down to a narrower waist, proportioned like a person, but not a person at all. The first thing that hit me was pure shock. My brain couldn't process what my eyes were seeing. It was like when you're driving and suddenly there's something unexpected in the road. That moment of, what the hell am I looking at? But this lasted longer because there was no logical explanation for what was standing there. The thing, I guess I should call it what it was, a Sasquatch, was facing my garden, looking at my vegetables with what seemed like interest. Its head was huge, not just tall but wide, with this flat, wide face. Its eyes were deep set under a prominent brow ridge, dark eyes that I couldn't make out the color of in the fading light. I remember thinking, "Don't move, just don't move." My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, in my ears. I couldn't have run if I wanted to. My legs felt like they were filled with concrete. Then those eyes shifted and looked directly at me. It wasn't a brief glance, it was a deliberate look, an acknowledgement that I was there. There was intelligence in that look, awareness, not animal curiosity, but something evaluating. After a few seconds that felt like an eternity, it looked back at my garden. That's when it made a sound, this low, humming growl that seemed to vibrate more than project. It wasn't particularly loud, but in the evening quiet, it carried. It didn't sound aggressive exactly, more like, I don't know, like it was talking to itself, or maybe warning me not to come closer. The sound made the hair on my arms stand up. I expected my dogs to go nuts. They'd bark at squirrels, delivery trucks, leaves blowing across the yard. Anything. But they just gave a couple of half-hearted barks, and then, to my complete disbelief, they turned tail and ran to the back door of the cabin, whining to be let in. These weren't timid dogs, but they wanted absolutely nothing to do with whatever was standing at the edge of my property, and then it moved closer. It stepped over my pathetic little garden fence like it wasn't even there, just one long stride with those massive legs, and was suddenly inside my garden. I thought about running then, but something told me that would be the worst thing I could do, so I just stood there, watering can still in my hand, trying not to breathe too loudly. The creature moved with this controlled power that's hard to describe, not clumsy or lumbering like you might expect from something so big, but deliberate, almost graceful in a way. Its arms hung lower than a human's would, with these huge hands partially covered in the same dark hair as the rest of its body. It leaned down near my zucchini plants, and I swear to God, it picked one of the smaller zucchinis and seemed to taste it, not eating it outright, more like testing it with its mouth. I could see its massive fingers handling the vegetable with surprising dexterity. Up close, I could see that while its body was covered in hair, its face was less densely furred, with leathery-looking skin showing through in places. This whole time, I hadn't moved a muscle. I was maybe 15 yards away from it now, close enough to smell it. A musky, earthy odor, like wet soil and vegetation, and something animal, but not quite like any animal I knew. After about a minute of examining my garden, it straightened up again to its full height. Then it turned and looked directly at me one more time. Our eyes met, and I had the strangest feeling that it was communicating something, not with words or even with clear intent. But there was a message there all the same. Recognition, warning, curiosity. I couldn't tell you, but it wasn't random. Then, as casually as it had come, it turned and walked back toward the woods. Not running, not hurrying, just walking away on two legs, its arms swinging slightly. It disappeared into the tree line and the shadows swallowed it completely. I stood there for I don't know how long. Minutes, probably. I was afraid to move, afraid it might come back, afraid I might break whatever spell had kept it from attacking me. When I finally did move, my legs were so shaky I nearly fell. I ran to the cabin, locked the door behind me, and found my dogs hiding under the kitchen table, still trembling. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the lights on and sat by the window with my grandfather's old hunting rifle across my lap, watching the edge of the woods until dawn. Nothing came. The next morning, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing, some kind of stress hallucination from the move, from the altitude, from anything that would explain what I'd seen. But then I went out to check my garden. There were footprints. Huge, human-shaped footprints in the soft soil near my vegetable beds. I put my boot next to one for comparison. My size 12 boot looked like a child's footprint next to it. The print was easily 15 inches long and about 6 inches wide at the ball of the foot. The toes were clearly defined, 5 of them splayed out slightly. There were broken zucchini stems where it had picked one, and several of the plants were crushed where it had stepped. Beyond the garden, I found a path of flattened grass leading back to the woods, and broken branches about 7 feet up on some of the trees at the forest edge, broken from something pushing through that was taller than a man. It wasn't my imagination, it was real. That was 26 years ago. I still live in the same place. I've never directly seen the creature again, though there have been times over the years when I've felt watched from the woods. I've found more footprints occasionally, usually after rainy nights when the ground is soft. Sometimes I'll find broken branches along the edge of the property, or areas of flattened grass too large to be deer beds. Once, about 5 years after the first encounter, I found 3 of my tomatoes missing, picked clean off the vine with no evidence of them falling or animals chewing at the stems. They were just taken, harvested almost. I've adjusted how I live out here. I never go out at night without my dogs anymore, and I've installed better outdoor lighting. I still keep my garden, but I've moved it closer to the house. Sometimes I leave a zucchini or 2 at the edge of the woods. They always disappear overnight. I don't know what I saw that evening. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, some unknown species. The label doesn't really matter. What I know is that it was intelligent, it was aware, and for whatever reason, it chose not to harm me when it easily could have. I've told a few locals over the years. Some believe me, most don't. The wildlife officers I spoke to politely took notes, but never followed up. One researcher came out from Missoula once, took plaster casts of some prints I found, got excited, and then I never heard from him again. So I keep to myself mostly, tend my garden, and occasionally glance toward the woods at dusk, wondering if it's out there watching. Sometimes on quiet evenings when I'm sitting on my porch, I swear I can hear that low humming growl drifting through the trees. And my dogs, different ones now but just as alert, will prick up their ears and move a little closer to me, but they never bark. Whatever it is, we've come to an understanding, this creature and I. This is its territory as much as mine. Maybe more so. I'm just grateful it lets me share it. Story 9. I'm still trying to process what happened that morning. It was late spring in Montana, about 6 months ago, but I remember it like it was yesterday. The memory hasn't faded at all. If anything, it's gotten more vivid over time. We live in a pretty remote area, about 20 miles from the nearest town. Our house sits at the edge of a large forest, with mountains in the distance. I've always loved the isolation, the quiet, and being surrounded by nature. Well, I used to love it anyway. That morning I woke up earlier than usual, around 5:30. The sky was just starting to lighten, that beautiful pre-dawn glow where everything looks bluish-grey. My partner was still sound asleep. Our 3 dogs, 2 German shepherds and a husky mix, were pacing around, obviously needing to go out. This was our normal routine. They'd wake me up, I'd let them out the back door, make coffee, and start my day. I threw on my robe and slippers, still half asleep, and shuffled to the back door. Our property slopes downward behind the house, with a clearing that extends about 100 yards before the tree line starts. We've got a little wooden deck with stairs that lead down to the yard. I opened the door, and the dogs bolted out like they always do, racing down the stairs and into the yard. I stepped onto the deck, enjoying the crisp morning air. That's when I saw it. About 50 feet away, right at the edge where our mowed lawn meets the taller grass, stood something that didn't belong there. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was massive, standing completely upright on 2 legs. My first thought was bear. But no, bears don't stand like that for long periods, and this thing's proportions were all wrong. It was covered in thick, shaggy hair, a deep brownish black color. The hair wasn't like fur exactly, more like long human hair, maybe 6 inches long, hanging from its body. But it was the size that really hit me. This thing had to be at least 8 feet tall, and the bulk of it, I'd guess easily 500 pounds or more, but not fat, just massive. I froze completely. My hand was still on the door handle. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. It's like my brain short-circuited. Then it just turned its whole body toward me, and I swear to God it looked right at me. That's when I realized this wasn't any animal I'd ever seen before. The face, Jesus, the face. It wasn't covered in hair like the rest of its body. The skin was a dark, brownish color, and the features were wrong, like something between an ape and a human, but not quite either. The eyes were set deep, and they looked intelligent. Too intelligent. I've lived in Montana my whole life. I've encountered black bears in my garbage, had mountain lions stalk me on hikes, been surrounded by elk during mating season, and even faced down a wolf once when I accidentally got between it and a kill. None of it prepared me for the pure, primal fear I felt at that moment. I couldn't move. I literally couldn't make my body respond. And then it made a sound that I will never, ever forget as long as I live. It wasn't a growl, it wasn't a roar, it was a scream or a holler that started low and rose to a pitch that felt like it was drilling into my skull. The sound echoed off the mountains and seemed to hang in the air. I've never heard anything like it before or since. It was like it was trying to communicate something, but in a language made of pure terror. I started crying, right there on my back steps, in my bathrobe. I started crying like a child. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I think it was the only response my body could manage. The strangest part? Our dogs, who will chase bears out of our yard without hesitation, who once cornered a mountain lion under our porch. They were cowering. All 3 of them were pressed against the stairs, whimpering. These are working dogs, bred for courage, and they were terrified. The creature and I stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only seconds. That's when I noticed more details. Its body looked female. There was a shape to the chest that looked like breasts, or at least pecs. The shoulders were huge, but not as massive as I'd expect from a male of whatever this was. The way it held itself, there was something almost feminine about it. Though those words feel ridiculous when talking about something so utterly terrifying, the face had expressions, actual expressions, not like an animal's limited range, but complex, shifting expressions. And I swear, I could see in its eyes that it understood that I was seeing it. There was recognition there, an awareness that we were having an encounter. It was looking at me as much as I was looking at it. After it screamed, it turned and walked, not ran, walked, down the hill toward the trees. It moved with a weird gait, not quite like a human walk, but definitely bipedal. With each step, I could see the muscles in its arms and legs shifting under all that hair. It had arms that hung longer than a human's would, but it didn't use them for walking. It moved with purpose, like it wasn't afraid of me at all, just done with the interaction. I stood frozen until it disappeared into the tree line. Then I frantically called the dogs inside, slammed the door, locked it, and collapsed on the kitchen floor, shaking uncontrollably. My partner heard the scream, but just rolled over and went back to sleep. When I tried to explain what happened later, they just shrugged and said, "We hear weird sounds out here all the time." But this wasn't just a weird sound. I know what I saw. About 3 weeks later, my friend Jake stayed over while passing through Montana. In the middle of the night, we were all woken up by that same scream, that same horrible, piercing scream. Jake was so terrified he grabbed his gun from his truck and kept it loaded beside the couch where he was sleeping. He didn't say much about it, but I could tell he was deeply shaken. He left the next morning, instead of staying another day like he'd planned. I finally worked up the courage to talk to some of the Native Americans who live a few miles down the road. The older man I spoke with wasn't surprised at all by my story. He called it a Wendigo and said they don't let their children play outside at night when they know it's around. He didn't seem afraid exactly, more respectful, like they've learned to coexist with something powerful and unpredictable. Since that morning, other strange things have happened. We'll hear small rocks hitting our tin roof at night. Not like hail, but like something is deliberately throwing pebbles. Sometimes we hear what sounds like trees being hit together, almost like a signal. These sounds always come from different directions, never the same place twice. The dogs refuse to go out at night now unless one of us is with them. Even then, they do their business quickly and race back to the door. These are dogs that used to love to roam our property at all hours. I've tried researching, looking up what I saw. Most accounts of Bigfoot or Sasquatch describe something similar to what I encountered. But reading other people's stories doesn't help. It just confirms that I'm not crazy, which is almost worse. I'd rather think I had some kind of breakdown than believe that these things are really out there. I don't go out alone at dawn anymore. I don't hike in the woods behind our house. I've installed motion-activated floodlights all around the property. My partner thinks I'm overreacting, but they didn't see what I saw. They didn't feel that connection, that moment of recognition when it looked at me. The worst part is the waiting. Every morning when I wake up, every evening as the sun sets, I wonder if today will be the day I see it again. Is it watching our house? Does it know our routines? Does it recognize me like I would recognize it anywhere? Sometimes when I'm alone, I think I catch glimpses of movement at the edge of the woods, something too tall, too large to be normal wildlife. Sometimes at night, I wake up with the absolute certainty that something is standing outside our bedroom window, watching. I've lived around predators my whole life. I respect them, understand them, know how to coexist with them. But this thing, I don't understand it. I don't know what it wants or what it's capable of. All I know is that nothing in my life has ever filled me with such complete, overwhelming terror as that creature did, standing in my backyard in the early morning light, looking at me with those two human eyes. I'm writing this because I need someone to believe me. My partner doesn't. The local authorities would think I'm crazy. But I know what I saw, and I know it's still out there, in the woods behind our house, watching and waiting for something. I just don't know what. Story 10. I've never been the type to see monsters where there aren't any. I've spent more time in the backcountry than most people spend in shopping malls. I know every sound the forest makes, every smell, every shadow. At least I thought I did until October 9th, 2018. That day changed everything for me. I'm still trying to make sense of what happened, still questioning what I saw, but I know what I experienced was real, no matter how many times I try to rationalize it away. I can't. I've been hunting the Cranberry Lake area in the Adirondacks for nearly 20 years. It's about an hour's drive from my home in Plattsburgh. I know those woods like the back of my hand, or at least I thought I did. I'd set up a bait site about 3 weeks earlier, tucked away in a spot that's always been good to me. Nothing fancy, just some corn and a salt lick to draw deer in. That morning started like any other hunting day. I woke up at 4:30, had my coffee and some eggs, packed my gear, and hit the road by 5:15. The weather was perfect, cool and crisp, around 40 degrees with a light breeze coming from the northwest, just enough to carry my scent away from where I expected the deer to approach. I parked my F-150 at the end of this old dirt logging road around 6:30, grabbed my .308 Remington, my day pack, and started hiking in. The hike to my bait site was about 1.5 miles through some pretty rough terrain. I'd worn my good boots, the waterproof ones with the extra ankle support, which turned out to be a blessing later. The first thing that struck me as odd was how the woods felt that morning. Usually, when I'm hiking in before dawn, there's a certain energy to the forest. Creatures stirring, birds starting their morning calls. But that day, as the sun began to rise, the woods seemed to get quieter rather than louder. By the time I was about a quarter mile from my bait site, the silence was so thick you could almost touch it. No squirrels chittering, no jays screaming at each other, nothing. Just the sound of my boots on the forest floor and my own breathing. The hair on the back of my neck started to stand up, but I told myself it was probably just a bear or maybe a bobcat that had the smaller critters spooked. I slowed down, moving more carefully, keeping my footfalls as quiet as possible. I brought my rifle up from where it had been hanging at my side, not quite shouldering it, but ready. The last 100 yards to the bait site, I was practically stalking, placing each foot with deliberate care. Through a gap in the trees, I caught movement at my bait site. Something large was hunched over where I'd left the corn and salt lick. My first thought was that it was a black bear. We get plenty of them up here, and they're not shy about taking advantage of bait sites meant for deer. But as I got closer, something felt wrong. The shape wasn't right. Bears have a distinctive hump at their shoulders, but this had a different profile. Broader, more upright, even though it was crouched down. I froze when I realized it wasn't feeding on my bait at all. There was a deer carcass on the ground, looked like a young doe, maybe a yearling. The creature was tearing into its hindquarters, pulling chunks away with its hands. Not paws, hands. The smell hit me next. If you've ever been around a gut pile that sat in the sun too long, you know that gamey, slightly sweet smell of death. This was similar but mixed with something else. A musky, almost skunk-like odor that was so strong I could taste it at the back of my throat. I must have made some small noise, or maybe the wind shifted, because suddenly the creature stopped feeding. It went completely still for a moment, then slowly raised its head and sniffed the air, and then it stood up. Jesus Christ, it stood up on two legs like it was the most natural thing in the world, and it kept going up and up and up. I'm 6 foot even, and this thing towered over me by at least 1.5 feet. Its shoulders were incredibly broad, had to be over 3 feet wide, with arms that hung down almost to its knees. Long, powerful arms, covered in dark hair, matted with blood around what I can only call its hands. The hair covering its body was dark brown, almost black in places, thick and shaggy like a buffalo's winter coat. I could see patches where it was clumped and matted across its chest and forearms, dark with what I realized was dried blood. It turned slowly, deliberately, until it was facing in my direction. I was partly concealed by a stand of young pines, but I knew it had sensed me. I raised my rifle slightly, not aiming directly at it, but ready. My hands were shaking so badly, I'm not sure I could have hit it anyway. For a long moment, we just stayed like that. Me half hidden in the trees, it standing there by the carcass. Then it made a sound I'll never forget as long as I live. A low, guttural huff that seemed to vibrate through the trees around us. Not quite a growl, not quite a grunt, but something primal that made every instinct in my body scream danger. It took one slow step in my direction, then another. I stepped back reflexively, my finger hovering near the trigger guard. I'd always told myself if I ever encountered a dangerous animal, I wouldn't hesitate to shoot to protect myself, but something stopped me. Some deeper instinct told me that firing at this creature would be the last mistake I'd ever make. After 2 steps, it stopped about 20 yards from where the deer carcass lay. It straightened up to its full height, God, it seemed even taller then, and squared its shoulders toward me. The message was unmistakable. This is mine. Back off. Then it let out a sound I can only describe as a growl, but that word doesn't do it justice. It was deep, starting low in its chest and building until it rolled through the woods like distant thunder. I felt it more than heard it, a vibration that went straight through my body to my core. I was frozen, unable to move, barely able to breathe, Time seemed to stretch out forever in that moment. Then, in one fluid motion that was shockingly fast for something so large, it turned back to the deer carcass, grabbed it by a hind leg, and started dragging it away. The deer must have weighed at least 80 pounds, but this thing moved like it was pulling a child's toy. As it moved into the denser undergrowth, branches snapped and small trees bent under its passage. The sound of its movement faded with surprising quickness. Within seconds, the forest was silent again, as if what I'd just witnessed had never happened. I stood there for I don't know how long, my rifle half raised, my heart pounding so hard I could feel each beat in my throat. When I finally managed to move, I backed away slowly, scanning the woods around me constantly, expecting the creature to reappear at any moment. Once I'd put about 50 yards between myself and the bait site, I turned and began walking quickly back the way I'd come. I didn't run. Everything I'd ever learned about predators told me running would be a mistake, but I moved as fast as I could while still keeping my footing on the rough terrain. By the time I reached my truck, my legs were shaking so badly I could hardly climb into the cab. I sat there for nearly 20 minutes, doors locked, engine running, trying to process what I'd just seen. My mind kept trying to turn it into something familiar. A bear standing on its hind legs, maybe, or even a man in some kind of ghillie suit. But I knew better. I've seen bears standing upright. They're impressive, sure, but they don't move like this thing did. They don't have that fluid, almost human way of walking, and no human I've ever met stands 7.5 feet tall with shoulders like a linebacker on steroids. I called my buddy Mike around noon, after I'd driven home and had a couple of stiff drinks to steady my nerves. I told him I'd seen something strange at my bait site and asked if he'd come back out with me to check it out. I didn't tell him exactly what I'd seen. I couldn't bring myself to say it out loud yet. We went back around 2 that afternoon. The bait site was empty. The corn and salt lick were untouched, but the ground was torn up, with large impressions that didn't look like any animal tracks I recognized. Several saplings were broken off about 5 feet up, marking what looked like a path heading northeast into thicker woods. There was no sign of the deer carcass, no blood, no drag marks, nothing. If it hadn't been for the disturbed ground and the broken trees, I might have convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Mike asked what I thought had happened, and I just shrugged and mumbled something about maybe a bear. He gave me a strange look, but didn't press the issue. We packed up my bait and headed back out. I haven't set up a site in that area since. That was 5 years ago, and I haven't told many people what I really saw that day. The few I've tried to tell either think I'm exaggerating or had some kind of weird hallucination. But I know what I saw. I still hunt, but never alone anymore. I always go with at least one partner, sometimes more. I don't go as deep into the backcountry as I used to, and I'm always back at my truck well before dark. Sometimes at night I still wake up in a cold sweat, the musky smell seemingly fresh in my nostrils, that guttural growl echoing in my ears. I can still see those eyes looking at me through the brush. Intelligent eyes, assessing, calculating. Not animal eyes, but not quite human either. Whatever I encountered that day, it let me go. It could have come after me, and we both knew it. Instead, it gave me a warning and took its kill elsewhere. I think about that a lot, about why it chose not to attack, and about what might happen if I ever ran into one again. I don't know what to call what I saw that day. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever. The name doesn't matter. What matters is that it's out there, in woods I thought I knew, in a place where thousands of people hike and hunt every year. And sometimes, when I'm sitting in my living room and the wind is blowing through the trees outside my window just right, I swear I can hear that growl again, rumbling from the mountains to the west, reminding me that there are things in this world we don't understand, things that don't want to be found. Story 11. I've never told this story to anyone outside my family. Even all these years later, I still get chills thinking about what happened that day, and I'm not sure anyone would believe me anyway. But I need to get this off my chest, so here goes. It was September 13th, 1973. That date is burned into my memory forever. I was living in a small house near the edge of the woods in Indiana County, Pennsylvania. It was a quiet place, kind of isolated, which is exactly how I liked it. We had a few acres, mostly wooded, with a nice clearing where the house sat. That morning I woke up earlier than usual. The sun wasn't even up yet, but something had disturbed my sleep. At first, I thought it might have been the wind, or maybe a raccoon digging through our trash again. But then I heard it clearer, heavy thuds coming from the front porch, not like someone knocking, more like something heavy moving around. I sat up in bed, instantly alert. My wife was still asleep beside me, and I didn't want to wake her if it was nothing. We'd had problems with bears in the area before, and I figured that's what it probably was. A black bear getting into our things. We'd been harvesting apples from our trees and had a barrel full of them on the porch, waiting to be processed for canning. I slipped out of bed and grabbed my robe. The floor was cold under my bare feet as I made my way down the hallway to the front of the house. The thuds continued, followed by what sounded like something being moved or dragged. Our front door had a small window at eye level, with curtains that we usually kept closed for privacy. I reached out and carefully pulled one side back just enough to peek through. What I saw next made my blood run cold. Standing on my porch, illuminated by the security light we kept on all night, was the most terrifying thing I've ever seen. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't any animal I recognized. It was standing upright on two legs, and it was huge, easily 7 feet tall, maybe taller. The creature was covered in thick, dark hair or fur that hung from its body in matted clumps. Its back was to me as it reached into our apple barrel with arms that seemed unnaturally long for its body. The proportions were all wrong. Those arms must have hung down past its knees when it stood straight. Its shoulders were massive, probably twice as wide as mine, and I'm not a small man. I stood frozen, unable to move or make a sound. I couldn't even breathe. Then, as if sensing my presence, it slowly turned around. I still remember every detail of that moment with perfect clarity. The creature's face was partially hidden by the same dark hair that covered its body, but I could clearly see a broad, flat nose and a wide mouth. It was chewing on one of our apples, juice running down into the hair around what I guess was its chin, but it was the eyes that really got me. They were deeply set under a prominent brow ridge, and they looked intelligent, not like an animal's eyes at all. When our eyes met, I felt a jolt of pure terror shoot through my entire body. It wasn't just that I was looking at some unknown creature, it was that it was looking back at me with what seemed like awareness. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a second or two, we stared at each other through the glass. Then my survival instincts finally kicked in. I let the curtain fall back and backed away from the door, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I turned and ran up the stairs, taking them two at a time. My son Jim was 22 at the time and living with us while saving up for his own place. He'd been in the army and had just come back from a tour in Vietnam the year before. If anyone would know what to do, it would be him. I burst into his room without knocking, which I never did, and shook him awake. "Jim," I hissed, trying to keep my voice down so the thing outside wouldn't hear me. "Jim, wake up! There's something on the porch." He was awake instantly, years of military training kicking in. "What is it? Someone trying to break in?" I shook my head, suddenly finding it hard to put into words what I'd seen. "No, I don't know what it is. It's huge, standing upright, eating our apples." Jim looked at me like I was crazy, but he reached under his bed and pulled out his rifle. He always kept it loaded, something my wife and I didn't approve of but couldn't talk him out of after he came back from the war. "Stay behind me," he said, moving toward the door. We crept down the stairs together, Jim in front with the rifle held ready. When we reached the front door, he positioned himself to one side and motioned for me to check if it was still there. With trembling fingers, I pulled back the curtain again. The creature was still on our porch, but now it was sitting on the barrel, casually eating another apple like it was the most normal thing in the world. It had turned slightly away from the door, giving us a side profile view. "Jesus Christ," Jim whispered when he leaned over to look. "What the hell is that?" "I don't know," I said, "but it's been out there for at least 10 minutes now." Jim's jaw set in that determined way I knew all too well. "I'm going to open the door. Stay back." Before I could stop him, he unlocked the door and pulled it open in one quick motion, bringing his rifle up to his shoulder in the same movement. The creature turned to face us, seemingly unalarmed by our sudden appearance or the weapon pointed at it. It just sat there, maybe 15 feet away, holding an apple in its massive hand. I got a better look at it now. Its body was muscular beneath all that hair, and its feet were enormous. Its face looked almost like a cross between a human and an ape, but not quite either one. Jim didn't hesitate. He fired 2 shots, the sound deafening in the early morning quiet. At that distance, he couldn't have missed. I was certain we'd have a dead whatever it was on our porch. But the creature showed no sign of being hit, no blood, no reaction of pain, nothing. It simply stood up, still holding the apple, and looked at us. I swear there was an expression of mild annoyance on its face, nothing more. Then it turned and ran. I've never seen anything move that fast. It crossed our entire front yard in what seemed like 3 or 4 bounds, its long arms swinging at its sides. Despite its size, it moved with an eerie grace, like an athlete. Within seconds, it had disappeared into the tree line at the edge of our property. Jim stood in the doorway, his rifle still raised, looking as shocked as I felt. "I hit it," he said, his voice barely audible. "I know I hit it. Twice. Point-blank range." We spent the next hour searching the yard and the edge of the woods for any sign of blood or tracks. We found footprints, huge ones, easily twice the size of my own feet, leading from the woods to our porch and then back again, but there was no blood, not a single drop. By this time, my wife and our daughter had woken up from the gunshots, and we had to explain what happened. My wife thought we were making it up at first, until we showed her the footprints. They were starting to disappear as the morning dew dried up, but she saw them clearly enough. We called the local police, but they weren't much help. The officer who came out looked at the remaining footprints and said they were probably from a bear walking funny. He didn't even take a cast or measurements. Said there had been reports of a large black bear in the area recently. When Jim insisted he'd shot at a 7-foot-tall hairy creature that walked on 2 legs, the officer just gave him that look. You know the one, like he was dealing with a lunatic. After the officer left, we sat around the kitchen table, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. Jim was the most shaken of all of us. He kept saying, "I hit it. I know I hit it." Nothing walks away from 2.30-06 rounds at that range. Nothing. We checked the barrel and the porch area. The creature had eaten nearly a dozen apples, leaving only the cores behind. The barrel itself had a dent in it, like something very heavy had been sitting on it. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep properly. Every noise from outside made me jump. Jim took to patrolling the property at night with his rifle, despite my objections. We never saw the creature again, but sometimes, especially on quiet nights, I'd hear heavy footsteps in the woods behind our house, too heavy for a deer, too rhythmic for a bear. I've read about Bigfoot sightings over the years, seen the blurry photos, and heard the recordings of strange howls. Some of them match what we saw that day, but none capture the most disturbing aspect of our encounter. Those eyes, and the way it simply ignored being shot at point-blank range. It's been almost 50 years now. Jim passed away 10 years ago from cancer, and my wife followed a few years later. I'm the only one left who was there that day, who saw that thing up close. I've had a lot of time to think about it, to try to make sense of what happened, Was it some kind of undiscovered primate? A person in a costume, though that wouldn't explain the immunity to bullets? Some kind of supernatural entity? I honestly don't know. All I know is what I saw. A 7-foot-tall, hairy creature on my porch eating apples, completely unaffected by 2 rifle shots to the torso. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, roaming the forests of Pennsylvania. Sometimes I wonder if it even remembers that morning, that brief moment when our eyes met, and I felt something I can't explain. A connection, a recognition of some kind. But mostly, I just wonder what the hell it was, and why 2 bullets at point-blank range didn't even make it flinch. Story 12. I never thought I'd be sharing this, but I need to get it off my chest. It's been over 20 years, and I still get nightmares about what happened that September night in 2001. My girlfriend at the time had suggested we take her 2 kids camping near Greenwater, Washington. I was all for it. I'd been there before, and there was this perfect spot on a ridgeline overlooking a small lake with Mount Rainier visible on the other side. Beautiful place, peaceful. Well, it was supposed to be peaceful anyway. We had a decent setup. My pickup with a camper on the back, enough camping gear to be comfortable, and my black lab who always came on these trips with us. The first day was perfect. We hiked a bit, fished in the lake, and the kids had a blast roasting marshmallows over the fire after dark. Normal camping stuff, nothing out of the ordinary. That second night though, man, I still get the chills thinking about it. We'd all gone to bed around 11. The kids were exhausted from playing all day, and we were pretty tired ourselves. The camper wasn't huge, but it was cozy. My lab was sleeping on the floor between the beds. Everything was quiet, except for the usual forest sounds. You know, the wind in the trees, maybe an owl hooting in the distance, nothing concerning. It must have been around 1 in the morning when we all got startled awake by what sounded like something huge crashing through the underbrush. Not just twigs snapping, but like whole branches breaking. My first thought was bear. They're common enough in that area. My girlfriend was instantly worried about the kids, who were now wide awake and scared. "What is that?" she whispered, clutching my arm. "Probably just a bear or maybe an elk," I said, trying to sound calm. "They make a lot of noise when they move through thick brush." The noise seemed to move away after a minute or 2, and I told everyone to try to go back to sleep. The kids were still scared, but they trusted me when I said it was just some animal passing by. My dog seemed a little on edge, but not barking or growling, which made me think whatever it was had moved on. Wrong. Maybe 10 minutes later we started hearing these sounds. Not normal forest sounds. These were vocalizations, grunts and groans, almost like a horse snorting, but different, lower, more guttural. My lab, who's usually pretty brave around wildlife, crawled under the bed and wouldn't come out. That's when I started getting really concerned. My girlfriend was getting increasingly freaked out. The kids were huddled against her, and she gave me that look that said, "Do something about this." "You need to go out there and scare it off," she said. "The kids are terrified, and look at the dog." I didn't want to go out there, but what choice did I have? I grabbed my 1 million candle power spotlight and my loaded .40 caliber Glock. I figured the light would be enough to scare off most wildlife, and the gun was just a precaution. The moment I stepped outside, I felt watched. The campfire had died down to just embers, casting this eerie red glow over our campsite. The sounds had stopped as soon as I opened the camper door, which was weird. Animals usually don't just go silent like that. I swept the spotlight around the perimeter of our camp. Nothing. The trees around us swayed slightly in the breeze, creating moving shadows that made it hard to be sure nothing was there. I walked around the camper, checked behind some nearby rocks, shined the light up into the closest trees. Nothing. I tossed some more wood on the fire to get it going again, mostly to reassure everyone inside. When I got back in the camper, I tried to play it off. See, nothing to worry about. Probably just a bear looking for food. It's moved on now. I was wrong. again. Not even 5 minutes after I'd come back inside, the sounds started up again, louder this time, closer. Those same grunts and groans, but now with this weird rhythmic pattern that almost sounded deliberate. My lab was shaking under the bed, and the kids were on the verge of tears. My girlfriend looked at me with this mix of fear and determination. You need to make it go away, now. This time I knew the spotlight and handgun might not be enough. I got my 12-gauge shotgun, loaded with buckshot. I actually duct-taped my spotlight to the barrel of the shotgun, which sounds crazy now, but made sense in the moment. I needed both hands on the gun, and still needed to see what I was dealing with. I put the Glock in its holster on my hip as a backup. Before I went out, I looked my girlfriend in the eyes and told her, if you hear shots, get ready to leave. We might need to pack up quick. The moment I stepped outside again, everything went quiet, but this time the silence felt heavy, intentional. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something was definitely watching me. Instead of just checking around camp, I decided to move toward the tree line about 30 yards away where the sounds had been coming from. The forest was thick there, lots of old growth and underbrush, perfect hiding spot for, well, anything. I moved slowly, sweeping my light back and forth. My finger wasn't on the trigger, but the safety was off. About 20 yards from camp, I caught something in the beam of my light that made my blood run cold. Eyes, two huge eyes reflecting back at me from between the trees. At first, I still thought bear. A big black bear standing on its hind legs, maybe. But as I focused the light, something felt wrong. The eyes were too high off the ground for a normal bear, and they didn't look away from the bright light like an animal should. They just stared. I called out, "Hey, get out of here!" Thinking maybe it was actually some hiker or something, though that made no sense at 1 in the morning. No response. Just those eyes, unblinking in the glare of my spotlight. I took a few more steps forward, getting maybe 40 to 50 feet from whatever it was. That's when it moved. The sound was incredible, like a bulldozer plowing through the forest, branches snapping, undergrowth being crushed. But fast, way faster than something that big should move. I swung my light to follow the sound and caught those eyes again, closer now. And that's when it made a sound I'll never forget. It wasn't a growl or a roar like a bear. It was deeper, louder, almost like someone had amplified the sound of a lion's roar and mixed it with something else. Something human, but not quite. It echoed through the trees and seemed to vibrate in my chest. I finally got a decent look at it when it stepped partially into a small clearing. The width of this thing, Jesus. It was as wide as it was tall, covered in dark hair or fur, standing upright on 2 legs. It was no bear. I don't remember consciously deciding to shoot. My body just reacted. I fired 3 rounds from the shotgun in rapid succession. The flash and noise were disorienting in the dark forest, but I saw the thing flinch and turn. It crashed away downhill, away from our camp, moving incredibly fast for something so massive. I wasn't thinking clearly. Adrenaline had taken over. I dropped the shotgun, pulled my Glock and fired the entire clip in the direction it had gone. I wasn't trying to kill it at that point. I just wanted it to keep going, to get as far away from us as possible. Back at camp, I could hear screaming. My girlfriend and the kids were panicking inside the camper. I ran back, scooped up the shotgun on the way, and burst through the door. We're leaving now. Pack only what you absolutely need. My girlfriend was wide-eyed, clutching the kids to her. What was it? What did you shoot at? I couldn't answer her. I just couldn't form the words. Just pack. We need to go. We threw our sleeping bags and a few essential items into the truck in record time. My lab was so scared, he jumped right into the cab without being told. I didn't even bother putting out the fire properly, just kicked dirt over it and hoped for the best. Within 15 minutes of the shooting, we were bumping down the forest road in the dark, headlights bouncing off the trees. My girlfriend kept asking what I'd seen. The kids were crying in the back seat. I just drove, knuckles white on the steering wheel, checking the rear-view mirror constantly. It wasn't until we hit the main highway that I started breathing normally again. We drove straight through to her place, arriving just as the sun was coming up. Over the following days, she kept pushing me to tell her what I'd encountered. I couldn't. How do you tell someone you shot at something that shouldn't exist? That the stories and legends might be real? I just kept saying it was a bear. But she knew I was lying. She'd heard that roar too. Our relationship didn't last much longer after that. There were other issues, sure, but that night created a wall between us, a secret I couldn't share. The kids had nightmares for weeks. I've never gone back to that spot. Sometimes I think about it, wonder if there might still be evidence there. My spent shotgun shells, the .40 caliber casings, maybe broken branches or something else. Blood, fur, proof. If I ever do go back, I won't go alone, and I'll bring something a hell of a lot more substantial than a 12 gauge and a handgun, something that would stop a truck. It's been over 2 decades now, and I still wake up sometimes hearing that sound, feeling those eyes watching me through the trees. Whatever I encountered that night near Greenwater, it wasn't supposed to be there. It wasn't supposed to exist, but it did, it does, and sometimes I wonder if it remembers me too. Story 13. I've lived in Florida my whole life, but I never believed any of the weird stories people tell about creatures in the swamps or woods, not until last summer anyway. I moved to Pine Haven Mobile Home Park about 2 years ago. It's not fancy, but it's affordable and sits right next to this beautiful orange grove. Most of the residents are older folks or working families. I'm in my 30s, living alone with my dog, Max, a German Shepherd mix who's usually pretty chill. Everything was normal until about 3 months ago. I first heard the rumors from Mrs. Carson, who watches the neighborhood kids when parents are working. She mentioned that several children had been talking about seeing a big monster in the grove. I laughed it off. Kids and their imaginations, right? Florida's full of wildlife. Probably just a bear, though they're rare in our part of the state. Then adults started talking. Jim, from 2 lots down, said he saw something huge moving between the trees one evening while having a smoke on his porch. Susan claimed something had gone through her trash, even though it had been secured with bungee cords. The lid was completely removed, not knocked off, and there was no mess, just specific food items taken. I didn't pay much attention until that night in July. It was hot, even for Florida, and I had all my windows open with just the screens closed. Around 2 in the morning, Max started barking. Not his usual, there's a raccoon bark, but this deep, threatening growl I'd never heard from him before. At first, I tried to ignore it. Max, quiet down, I mumbled, half asleep. But he wouldn't stop. He ran to the window facing the orange grove, his hackles raised, barking frantically. Something about his behavior sent a chill through me despite the summer heat. I got up and went to the window. The full moon was bright enough to see pretty clearly into the grove. That's when I saw it. Between 2 orange trees stood this figure. It was huge, easily 8 feet tall, completely covered in black fur that looked matted in some places. The moonlight was behind it, so I couldn't make out facial details, but I could see its outline perfectly. It stood upright, completely still, like it was watching the mobile homes, watching us. My throat closed up. I couldn't even call for Max to be quiet anymore. The thing was just standing there, perfectly motionless, except for what looked like slow, deliberate breathing. Its arms hung down almost to its knees. Max was going absolutely insane now, scratching at the screen, snarling with his teeth bared. I was terrified the creature would hear him and come toward us, so I grabbed his collar and pulled him away from the window. When I looked back out, it was gone. Just disappeared. I spent the rest of the night with all my lights on, doors locked, clutching a baseball bat, with Max pacing nervously beside me. The next morning I convinced myself I'd imagined it. Maybe it was the heat, or maybe I was half dreaming. But when I went outside to walk Max, there was a small group of neighbors gathered at the edge of the grove. "You see anything weird last night?" asked Paul, an older guy who'd lived in the park for 20 years. My stomach dropped. "Why?" He pointed to the ground. There, pressed into the soft dirt between the mobile home park and the first row of orange trees, were footprints. Huge footprints. They were roughly human-shaped, but at least 17 inches long and extraordinarily wide. They led from deeper in the grove toward the homes, then back again. That wasn't all. About 7 feet up on one of the trees, a branch about 4 inches thick was snapped clean off. Not torn or chewed, broken with what must have been incredible strength. The break was so clean it almost looked cut, except there were no saw marks. "That wasn't there yesterday," Susan said, pointing at the broken limb. "I was out here watering my plants in the evening. That branch was fine." Word spread quickly through our small community. By midday, almost everyone was talking about it. That's when Frank, who works nights as a security guard at a warehouse about a mile away, told us what he'd seen 3 nights prior. "I was walking home around 4 in the morning," Frank said, his voice lower than usual. "Took the shortcut through the east side of the grove, thought I heard something moving, figured it was deer or wild pigs. Then I saw it." According to Frank, he'd gotten a much closer look than I had. The creature was walking upright, like a man but not quite right. He described it as having enormous hands with long fingers, completely covered in that black fur. The face was flat, with a broad nose that had what looked like an old scar running across it. One shoulder was noticeably higher than the other, giving it an asymmetrical appearance. "It saw me," Frank said. "Looked right at me with these eyes that reflected the moonlight. Then it just turned and walked away. Didn't run, just walked. But it covered ground so fast, like each step was twice what a human could make." I felt sick hearing this. It matched exactly what I'd seen, but with details I couldn't make out from my window. More stories started coming out. The Rodriguez kids claimed it had chased them when they were playing in the grove after school. They said it moved on 2 legs but could drop down and use its arms when it needed to move faster. Mrs. Hernandez reported that something had been quietly raiding her outdoor freezer. Again, no mess, just food taken. The pattern was always the same, a massive black-furred humanoid, moving with surprising agility for its size. Always quiet except for occasional heavy breathing or what some described as a low, rumbling sound from its chest. Multiple people mentioned the asymmetrical shoulders and the scarred nose. Within days, the atmosphere in Pine Haven changed. People stopped hanging out outside after dark. Parents wouldn't let their kids play unsupervised anywhere near the grove. Some residents even left to stay with family elsewhere until whatever this was moved on. I stayed, partly because I had nowhere else to go, and partly because, despite my fear, I was curious. I started keeping a journal of sightings, comparing notes with neighbors. The creature seemed most active during the full moon and the days surrounding it. Then came the night that still gives me nightmares. About a week after my first sighting, I was up late watching TV. Max had been restless all evening, pacing and whining. Around 1 in the morning, he suddenly went completely quiet and stiff, staring at my front door. The hair on his back stood up, but he didn't bark, almost like he was too scared to make noise. That's when I heard it, a slow, heavy breathing right outside my door. Then a smell seeped in, musky, wild, like wet animal fur mixed with something else I couldn't identify. My whole body froze. The doorknob slowly turned, but thankfully I had locked it. There was a pause, then the gentlest pressure against the door, not a pound or a push, just testing it. I sat there, remote control clutched in my hand, too terrified to move. The breathing continued for what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds. Then I heard heavy footsteps moving away across my small porch. Gathering my courage, I crept to the window and peeked through the blinds. What I saw will stay with me forever. It was standing in my yard in full moonlight, its back to me. The black fur covered every inch of its body. It had to be 8 feet tall, with a build that was powerful but lean. Not bulky like a gorilla, more like an incredibly large, muscular human covered in fur. Its proportions were just wrong, arms too long, torso too narrow for its height. As if sensing me watching, it turned its head. Not its whole body, just its head, rotating further than a human neck should allow. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I made out those reflective eyes Frank had mentioned, catching the moonlight and glowing a dull amber. It looked directly at me through the window. I dropped the blind and fell backward, crawling away from the window. Max was under my coffee table, trembling. I heard those heavy footsteps circle my mobile home, pausing at each window. At one point, I swear I heard sniffing, like it was smelling the air around my home. This went on for almost 20 minutes before the footsteps finally receded toward the grove. I didn't sleep at all that night. In the morning, I found huge, muddy handprints on each of my windows. On my front door was a single, clear print where it had pressed its hand against the door. The fingers were unnaturally long, with what looked like sharp nails at the tips. When I reported this to some neighbors, several admitted to having similar experiences. Whatever this thing was, it seemed to be systematically checking out each home in our community. That day, several more families packed up and left. I called the local sheriff's office, but they were dismissive, suggesting it was probably a bear, despite my insistence that bears don't walk exclusively on 2 legs or have hands with fingers. The next night, I set up my phone to record the grove from my window. I left it running all night while I tried to sleep in the back room with Max. In the morning, I checked the footage. For hours, nothing happened. Then, at 3:16 in the morning, a dark shape moved at the edge of the grove. The quality was poor in the low light, but you could clearly see something massive moving between the trees. It stayed there for almost an hour, just watching our community. Occasionally it would shift position or reach up to grab a branch, showing off its height. I showed the video to my neighbors. Some were convinced it was just shadows or a bear. Others, especially those who had seen it themselves, knew better. That evening, a group of 5 men from our community, including Frank and Paul, decided they were going to go into the grove with rifles to look for it. I begged them not to. Whatever this thing was, it hadn't actually hurt anyone yet, but they were determined to protect the community. They headed into the grove around dusk. About an hour later, we heard shouting, then a single gunshot. Minutes later, all 5 men came running back, white-faced and terrified. Paul's shirt was torn, and Frank had lost his rifle. According to them, they'd found a sort of nest deep in the grove, a depression in the ground with bent saplings forming a crude shelter. Around it were food wrappers and containers from trash cans in our community. As they were examining it, they heard movement behind them. They turned to see the creature standing just 30 feet away, partially hidden by a tree. Frank raised his rifle, but before he could fire, the thing moved, so fast they could barely track it. It circled around behind them, making that low rumbling sound. Paul panicked and fired a shot into the air. The creature responded by breaking a massive branch off a nearby tree and throwing it at them with incredible force. They ran, and it didn't chase them far, just enough to make them leave its territory. The next morning, County Animal Control finally showed up after multiple calls. They searched the grove half-heartedly, found the nest the men had described, and concluded it was probably a transient black bear. They set up a trap with bait, but it was never triggered. For 2 more weeks, sightings continued. Always at night, always with the same description. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature seemed to vanish. The full moon passed with no sightings. Then another week. People slowly began relaxing again. Many residents have convinced themselves it was just a bear or an escaped exotic pet, or even a collective delusion. But those of us who saw it up close know better. Whatever was living in that grove wasn't any known animal. I still live at Pine Haven. Max still growls sometimes at night, looking toward the grove. I've searched online for similar reports and found scattered accounts across Florida and other southeastern states. Always the same description. 8 feet tall, black fur, asymmetrical shoulders, scar across the nose. I keep my doors locked now and never go out after dark, because sometimes when the moon is full, I can feel eyes watching from the grove, and I know it's still out there, somewhere. Story 14. I think about that day in 1974 almost every time I'm outside after dark. Sometimes I'll be taking out the trash or walking to my car, and I'll get this feeling like something's watching me from just beyond the tree line. My neck hairs stand up, and I get that same cold sweat I had when I was 16. I've tried telling people what happened, but most think I'm making it up or exaggerating. I'm not. It was summer in Colorado, one of those perfect days with clear blue skies that make you want to be outside. I was staying with my brothers in Jefferson County, in the foothills west of Denver. If you know the area between Indian Hills and Kittredge, it's beautiful country, pine trees, rocky outcrops and winding creeks. But there's something else out there too. That morning, my brothers had gone into town for supplies, and I decided to take their dog, a big German Shepherd mix named Rex, for a hike along one of the creeks. Rex was a good dog, loyal and smart, but he had this stubborn streak. My oldest brother always kept him on a chain leash because Rex would take off after deer or rabbits if he caught their scent. I remember wrapping the chain around my wrist a couple of times before we set off. It was a stupid thing to do, but I was 16 and thought I was strong enough to control a 70-pound dog if he decided to bolt. I was wrong. We'd been hiking for maybe an hour, following this little creek that cut through a ravine. It wasn't a marked trail or anything, just a game path that followed the water. The sun was filtering through the pine branches, creating these dappled patterns on the ground. Everything was peaceful. Birds chirping, the occasional splash of a fish jumping in the creek. Then Rex froze. His ears perked up, and he started making this low, growling sound deep in his throat. I'd never heard him make that noise before. It wasn't his normal, "there's a squirrel" bark, or even his warning growl when strangers came to the house. This was different. Every muscle in his body tensed. I tried to calm him down, whispering and patting his head, but he wasn't paying any attention to me. His eyes were locked on something in the thick brush on the other side of the creek. I couldn't see anything, just a wall of green. Then it happened so fast. Rex lunged forward with so much force that I nearly dislocated my shoulder. The chain bit into my wrist, and before I could react, I was being dragged behind him through the underbrush. I tried digging my heels in, but the ground was slick with pine needles and damp soil, and I just slid along behind him. "Rex, stop!" I was yelling, but it was like he couldn't hear me. Branches whipped across my face, and I could feel scratches opening up on my arms and legs as we crashed through the brush. Then the chain caught on something, probably a tree root or a rock, and jerked to a stop. Rex was still lunging forward, barking frantically now, but the chain held fast. My wrist was bleeding where the metal had cut into my skin, and I was trying to unwrap it when I noticed that Rex had suddenly gone silent. Not quiet, silent. His barks cut off in mid-sound, like someone had flipped a switch, and he was backing up now, pressing against my legs, trembling. I'll never forget what happened next. The silence was absolute. Even the birds had stopped singing. The only sound was the gentle gurgle of the creek and Rex's panicked breathing. I pushed aside some branches to see what had spooked him so badly, and that's when I saw it. Standing in the middle of the creek, not 20 feet away, was the biggest, I don't even know what to call it, a figure, a creature, something that should not exist. It was massive. Easily 7 or 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders that tapered to a narrower waist. The whole body was covered in long, light brown hair. Not fur exactly, but more like human hair, just everywhere. It was standing upright on two legs, completely still, with water dripping from its arms, which hung down almost to its knees. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I've never felt fear like that before or since, like my blood had turned to ice and my brain just short-circuited. It wasn't just the size of the thing or how out of place it was. It was the feeling it gave off. This sense of raw power and intelligence. The strangest thing, though, is that I can't remember its face clearly. I know I saw it. I was staring right at it. But when I try to picture it now, it's like there's a blur where the face should be. I remember dark eyes, deep set under a heavy brow. I remember thinking it looked almost human, but not quite. But the specifics slip away every time I try to focus on them. For what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, we just stared at each other. It didn't move. I didn't move. The only sound was Rex whimpering behind me. Then it shifted its weight, and the water splashed around its legs. That tiny sound broke whatever spell had frozen me in place. I backed up slowly, keeping my eyes on it, tugging Rex with me. He wasn't resisting anymore. He was practically crawling backward on his belly. We made it about 10 feet before my foot caught on a root, and I stumbled. It was just a small noise, but the creature's head snapped toward the sound, and I swear I could feel its gaze locking onto me like a physical weight. That's when it took a step toward us, just one step, but it was enough. I turned and ran, dragging Rex behind me. I didn't care about the branches hitting my face or the rocks cutting into my feet through my sneakers. All I knew was that I had to get away from that thing. I don't remember much about the run back. It's all a blur of panic and adrenaline. I do remember bursting out of the woods and nearly colliding with my brothers, who had just returned and were unloading supplies from their truck. They said I was hysterical, babbling about something in the woods. They thought maybe I'd seen a bear, which would have been scary enough. But I knew it wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand upright like that. Bears don't have arms that hang down to their knees. Bears don't look at you with eyes that seem to know things. My oldest brother grabbed his rifle, and we all went back. Me, my two brothers, and Rex, who had to be practically dragged. We didn't go all the way to the creek. About halfway there, we heard something moving through the woods. Something big that was breaking branches as it moved. The sound was coming toward us. We climbed the nearest pine tree, an old one with branches strong enough to hold us. My brothers hauled Rex up too, which was no easy feat with him struggling and whimpering. We sat there barely breathing as the sounds got closer. I'll never forget the feeling of being in that tree, pressed against the rough bark, the pine sap sticky on my hands, watching the underbrush for any sign of movement. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. Then we saw the brush moving about 50 yards away. The branches parted, and for a second, just a split second, I saw that same light brown hair through the gaps in the foliage. Then it was gone. We stayed in that tree until the sun started to set. None of us wanted to be the first to suggest coming down. Finally, my oldest brother said we needed to get back before dark, and we carefully climbed down, keeping our eyes on the spot where we'd seen the movement. The walk back to the house was tense. We moved in a tight group, my brother with the rifle scanning the woods constantly. Rex stayed so close to us, he was practically walking on our heels. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made us freeze. When we got back, my brothers tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was a bear standing on its hind legs. Maybe it was a moose, though moose aren't common in that area. Maybe I'd seen a man in a hunting suit, but they hadn't seen what I saw. They hadn't felt what I felt. That night, Rex wouldn't leave the house. He kept growling at the windows, the hair on his back standing straight up. We all slept in the main room, with the lights on and the rifle propped against the wall. The next morning, my brothers and I went back to the creek with Rex, who resisted every step of the way. We found where the chase had happened. There were broken branches and clear signs where something heavy had moved through the brush. At the creek, we found footprints in the mud, huge, human-like footprints. easily 16 inches long. My middle brother took photos with his Polaroid camera. When they developed, you could clearly see the prints with 5 toes and a distinct arch, just like a human foot, but massive. We measured one using a hunting knife for scale. It was just over 16 inches. The weirdest part came next. My oldest brother, always the skeptic, said we should follow the tracks, see where they led. We tracked them downstream for about a quarter mile before they disappeared into a rocky area. The last clear print we found was different. It looked like the creature had pushed off hard, almost like it had jumped. We looked up and saw a ledge about 15 feet above us. To reach it would have required a near vertical leap from a standing position. No human could have made that jump. No bear either. We didn't follow any further. By unspoken agreement, we turned and headed back to the house. We didn't talk much on the way back. What was there to say? My oldest brother kept those Polaroids for years. He showed them to a forest ranger once, who said they were probably bear tracks distorted by rain. But it hadn't rained in weeks, and bears don't have 5 distinct toes like that. I've been back to Colorado many times since then, but I've never gone back to that specific creek. I can't bring myself to. Even thinking about it now makes my heart race and my palms sweat. I've read accounts of Bigfoot sightings over the years, and some of the descriptions match what I saw, but most of those stories feel embellished like campfire tales. What I saw was real. It was standing there in the creek, water dripping from its body, watching me with those eyes I still can't clearly remember. Sometimes I dream about it, and in the dreams, I can see its face perfectly. But when I wake up, the details slip away like water through my fingers. It's been almost 50 years, but I still get that feeling sometimes, that I'm being watched from just beyond the trees. And I wonder if it remembers me too. Story 15, Eisendarm. I still can't believe I'm typing this out. Been holding this in for decades, but I need to get it off my chest. Maybe someone here has experienced something similar. It all started back in November of 1975. I was living in Jacksonville, Florida at the time, in this really secluded place off the beaten path. My house sat about 1/3 of a mile from the nearest actual road, connected only by this dirt path that ran alongside a creek. Not the kind of place you'd expect trouble, you know? Just quiet, peaceful living. That evening, I was walking home after visiting a friend. The sun was already setting, casting long shadows through the trees. The air had that autumn chill to it, not cold by northern standards, but cool enough for a light jacket in Florida. I was about halfway home when I first noticed something wasn't right. It was the sound of footsteps on dried leaves. Not mine, but something else's. At first, I thought it might be a deer or some other animal. But when I stopped walking to listen, the footsteps stopped too. I stood completely still for maybe 30 seconds, straining to hear anything. But there was nothing. Just the sound of the creek and some distant birds. I started walking again, a bit faster this time, and there they were again. Footsteps matching my pace but slightly out of sync. Stop. They'd stop. Walk. They'd walk. My heart started racing. I told myself it was just an echo or my imagination, but deep down, I knew better. I picked up my pace, and whatever it was picked up its pace too. That's when I completely lost my cool. I just bolted, ran as fast as I could all the way home, jumped inside, and locked the door behind me. I was breathing so hard I thought my lungs would burst. I didn't look back once during that sprint, too afraid of what I might see. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just my nerves playing tricks on me. For a few years, I actually managed to push the incident to the back of my mind. Fast forward to the summer of 1978. I'd been back to that creek many times since then without incident, which helped ease my fears. This particular day, I decided to go fishing with my brother and a friend. We parked at the end of that dirt road and hiked down to a good spot by the creek. After setting up, I realized I'd forgotten our tackle boxes in the car. I'll go grab them, I volunteered, not thinking twice about heading back alone. The midday sun was bright, and any lingering fears I had about that place seemed silly in the daylight. I was about halfway to the car when that familiar feeling crept over me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I got this overwhelming sense I was being watched. I slowed down and listened carefully, and there they were again. Heavy footsteps, not even trying to be quiet this time. I spun around, expecting to see nothing, just like before. But this time, there it was. A tall, hairy figure, just standing between two large oak trees, about 40 yards away. I can't even properly describe what I saw. It was huge, maybe 7 or 8 feet tall, covered in dark brown or black hair, standing upright on 2 legs. The thing that struck me most was how still it was, just watching me, not moving, not making a sound. I dropped everything I was holding, my mouth went completely dry, and for a second I couldn't move. It was like my brain couldn't process what my eyes were seeing. Then survival instinct kicked in, and I ran to the car, fumbling with my keys, hands shaking so bad I could barely get the door unlocked. I peeled out of there, gravel flying, and drove straight to where my brother and friend were fishing. I was white as a sheet, they said. "What happened?" my brother asked as I jumped out. I just kept saying, we gotta go now." I couldn't even articulate what I'd seen. They thought I was having a panic attack or something, but they packed up quickly, and we left. I never went back to that creek again, but that wasn't the end of it. In May of 1976, before that second creek incident, my wife and I had moved to the Double D Ranch in Marion County. It was a beautiful piece of property, with plenty of room for our horses and kids to run around. We thought it was going to be our forever home. One night, we were returning home after a late dinner with friends. It must have been around 2 in the morning when we pulled up to the house. The yard was dimly lit by our porch light, but something caught my eye at the edge of the property, where our yard met the tree line, 2 glowing red eyes reflecting the light from our car's headlights. I turned to my wife. "Do you see that?" I whispered. She nodded, her face pale in the dashboard lights. "What is it?" "Stay in the car," I told her, reaching for the .38 I kept in the glove compartment. I always carried protection living that far out in the country, normal precaution for wildcats or coyotes, but this was something else entirely. I stepped out slowly, gun at my side. The red eyes didn't move, didn't blink. As my vision adjusted to the darkness, I could make out a massive silhouette, easily over 7 feet tall and built like a linebacker. I estimated it weighed at least 300 pounds. "Hey!" I shouted, hoping to scare it off, thinking maybe it was just a bear standing on its hind legs. But bears don't have glowing red eyes like that. The figure started moving, not running away, but walking slowly toward me. That's when I raised my gun and fired 2 shots. I know I hit it. I'm a good shot, and it was only about 30 yards away. The bullets should have dropped anything living, but this thing barely flinched. It just turned and walked back into the woods, disappearing into the darkness, like it hadn't just been shot twice at close range. My wife was crying in the car. We rushed inside, locked all the doors, and stayed up the rest of the night with the lights on and my gun ready. That was just the beginning of our nightmare at the Double D Ranch. The next few weeks, things started happening that I couldn't explain. First, it was our fence. Solid wooden posts pulled clean out of the ground, not knocked over, not broken, but pulled up like someone had yanked them out with tremendous strength. Then our animals started getting attacked. It wasn't like normal predator attacks. Whatever was doing, this wasn't just killing for food. A few chickens disappeared, which wasn't that unusual in farm country. But then we found our pet rabbits. They'd been ripped right out of their cages, the metal wire torn open like it was paper. The worst was when we found our Doberman puppy. He was only 6 months old, a strong, healthy dog we'd gotten partly for protection. We found him about 50 yards from the house, his neck broken and his stomach slit open. There was no blood around him, which meant he'd been killed somewhere else and placed there for us to find, like a message. Our horses started getting spooked at night, refusing to stay in the barn. One morning I went out to check on them and found our yearling colt in the corner of the pasture, still alive but brutally attacked. He was missing chunks of flesh, an eye and one ear. The vet couldn't explain it, said it wasn't consistent with any predator he knew. We had to put the poor thing down. Every night we'd hear sounds, not normal forest sounds that you get used to living in the country. These were different. Howls that didn't sound like coyotes or wolves, screams that didn't sound human or animal, and high-pitched whistles that seemed to come from different directions at once, like whatever was making them was circling our property. My kids started refusing to play outside. My 10-year-old son had a tree house about 100 yards from our house. One day, he came running back, saying he'd found dark, coarse hairs all over his treehouse floor, hairs that weren't from any animal we had on the property. I was getting desperate. I started setting traps. Not just regular animal traps, but razor blades secured to tree limbs at about 7 feet high around our property. The next morning, I found several of them broken off, with more of those same dark hairs caught in them. The final straw came 6 weeks after that first night when we saw the red eyes. We had this thoroughbred, beautiful horse, about 1,500 pounds, strong, healthy animal. One morning I went outside and found him dead in our front yard. Not in his pasture where he belonged, but dragged all the way to our front yard. His body was mutilated, throat torn open, with chunks missing. But what scared me most were the tracks around him, massive three-toed footprints pressed deep into the ground, deeper than a human print would go, even from a big man. That was it. That same day, I packed up my family and whatever belongings we could fit in our station wagon and U-Haul. We left most of our stuff behind, left the state entirely. To this day, I don't know what was stalking us at the Double D Ranch. I don't know if it was the same thing I encountered years earlier by that creek in Jacksonville. All I know is that no explanation I've ever heard, bear, wildcat, human predator, fits what we experienced. Sometimes I still wake up hearing those whistles, and I wonder if it's still out there watching, waiting for someone else to move onto that property. I never checked if anyone else bought the ranch after us. Some things you're better off not knowing. Story 16. I've never told this story to anyone outside my closest friends. Even now, typing this out, I'm second-guessing myself. But after seeing similar accounts here, I need to share what happened to me back in the late 90s in southern Indiana. It was August of 1997 or 1998. I can't remember exactly which year anymore. My buddies and I were in our early 20s and loved camping, especially in places off the beaten path. One of our friends had access to private land outside Campbellsburg, Indiana, about 100 acres with some really interesting features. Dense forest, a few small cave systems, and this old abandoned cabin that hadn't been used in decades. The property owner was a distant relative of my friend, who basically let us use it whenever we wanted, as long as we didn't trash the place. The first time we went, 4 of us packed up my buddy's old Chevy van with camping gear, a couple coolers of beer and food, and headed out there on a Friday afternoon. We arrived just before sunset and decided to set up camp on this ridge that overlooked a small valley. It was beautiful. You could see the sun setting through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. The spot was perfect, flat enough for our tents, with a natural clearing for a fire pit. After setting up camp, we cooked some burgers over the fire, drank a few beers, and told the usual bullshit stories you tell around a campfire. Everything was completely normal. The night air was warm but comfortable, with that typical August humidity hanging in the air. Crickets and tree frogs were making their usual racket. Nothing seemed off at all. Around 10 o'clock, I needed to take a leak, so I walked about 20 yards from camp toward the edge of the ridge where it sloped down into the valley. I remember standing there, looking up at the stars through breaks in the tree canopy while doing my business. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, heavy ones, coming up the steep incline of the ridge directly below where I was standing. At first, I thought it might be one of my friends playing a joke, but I could see all three of them still sitting around the fire. These steps were slow, deliberate, and powerful, like something really big was climbing up the ridge. What struck me immediately was the rhythm. It wasn't a four-legged animal. This was bipedal, 2 feet, like a person, but much heavier. I froze completely. The footsteps got closer and closer to the top of the ridge, and I could hear branches breaking under its weight. My heart was hammering in my chest so hard I thought whatever it was would hear it. Then, just as the steps reached the edge of the ridge, maybe 15 feet from where I stood, they stopped. Complete silence for what felt like forever but was probably only 10 seconds. Then, without warning, I heard it take off running. Not toward me, thank God, but parallel to the ridge, deeper into the woods. The sound of it crashing through the underbrush faded as it moved away. I practically sprinted back to the campfire, my legs shaking. My friends could tell something was wrong by the look on my face. When I told them what I'd heard, they laughed it off at first, said it was probably just a deer. But I knew the difference between a deer and what I'd heard. Deer don't walk on 2 legs, and they don't make the ground vibrate when they move. We stayed up a bit later than planned that night, keeping the fire going strong. Around midnight, the forest around us went completely silent. The sudden absence of insect and animal noises was unsettling. Then, cutting through that silence, came this sharp, high-pitched scream from somewhere in the valley. It wasn't human, at least no human I've ever heard, but it wasn't quite animal either. It was loud and piercing and seemed to echo through the trees. After that scream, nothing made a sound for at least an hour. No crickets, no frogs, nothing, like everything was holding its breath. We were all pretty freaked out, but tried to play it cool. Eventually, we turned in for the night. 2 of us slept in tents, while the other 2 crashed in the van. I was in one of the tents and had a hard time falling asleep, listening for any unusual sounds. Around 3 in the morning, I was jolted awake by yelling. My friend who was sleeping in the van was freaking out, shouting that something had reached through the partially open window of the van and taken food from a bag they'd left on the dashboard. He described it as a huge, dark arm covered in hair. We all got up, grabbed our flashlights, and looked around the campsite, but didn't see anything. The forest was dead quiet again. None of us slept much after that. When dawn finally broke, we checked around the campsite. That's when we found the gouges in the hillside, these deep impressions in the soft dirt where something heavy had climbed up. They weren't animal tracks exactly, more like where something big had disturbed the ground, digging in with considerable force to climb the steep incline. The marks were fresh, and they led right up to where I'd heard those footsteps stop the night before. We packed up and left that morning, earlier than we'd planned. On the drive home, we talked about what it could have been. A bear was the most logical explanation, but bears aren't common in southern Indiana, and what we experienced didn't match bear behavior. Plus, the bipedal footsteps I heard definitely weren't from a bear. We ultimately chalked it up as a weird experience and decided we were probably just spooked from being in an unfamiliar place. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. A year later, in August again, we decided to go back. I know that sounds crazy after what happened, but we convinced ourselves we'd just freaked ourselves out the first time. This time, we thought it would be smarter to camp down in the valley itself, near a small creek, rather than up on the exposed ridge. The first 3 nights were completely uneventful. We explored the cave entrances during the day, though we didn't go deep inside without proper equipment. Checked out the old cabin and had a great time. The cabin was this small, one-room structure with a collapsed roof in one corner. It probably dated back to the early 1900s and had been abandoned for decades. Inside was just rotting furniture, old bottles, and lots of animal droppings. On our 4th and final night, things changed. We were sitting around the campfire after dinner, just talking and enjoying our last night, when the forest gradually went silent again, just like it had the year before. The crickets stopped chirping one by one until there was nothing. We all noticed it and exchanged glances but didn't say anything at first. I remember checking my watch. It was about 9:30. As the silence continued, we decided to turn in earlier than usual. Something about that silence put us all on edge. I zipped myself into my tent around 10:30. Despite being anxious, I eventually drifted off to sleep. About an hour later, I woke up to the sound of those same heavy, two-legged footsteps I'd heard the year before. Only this time, they were coming down the opposite side of the valley. I lay perfectly still, listening as whatever it was made its way down the slope, through the trees, and then splash across the small creek that ran about 50 yards from our campsite. The footsteps continued, now on our side of the creek, moving slowly and deliberately toward our camp. My heart was racing, but I was too terrified to move or make a sound. Through the thin fabric of my tent, I could hear it shuffling around our campsite. There was a crash as our cooler was knocked over, followed by the sound of plastic containers being opened. I realized it was going through our food. For what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the thing rummaged around our campsite. I heard it breathing, deep, heavy breaths that sounded nothing like a human's. Eventually, the sounds moved away from the main camp area and toward the tents. That's when I made the biggest mistake, or perhaps had the most incredible experience of my life. I had to see what it was. I slowly, silently unzipped my tent just enough to peek out. At first, I couldn't see anything in the darkness. Then a cloud shifted, and moonlight filtered through the trees. That's when I saw it moving between the tents. It was huge, at least 7 feet tall, and covered in what looked like dark, coarse hair. It was hunched over slightly, but clearly walking on 2 legs. I must have made some small sound, because suddenly it turned in my direction. It moved toward my tent, and before I could react, its massive head was peering in through the small opening I'd created in the tent flap. I'll never forget what I saw. A large, wide face covered in the same coarse hair, with a pronounced brow ridge, and the eyes. They reflected the moonlight slightly, appearing as dark pools with just a hint of awareness behind them. Not animal eyes, not human eyes, but something in between. When our eyes met, I gasped involuntarily. The creature jerked back instantly, as if it was as startled by me as I was by it. It backed away from my tent and then moved with surprising speed back across the creek. I heard the splashing of water, followed by those heavy footsteps ascending the opposite valley wall, crashing through undergrowth as it went. I lay there, completely unable to move, until morning light began to filter through my tent. None of us had a great night's sleep, and when we gathered around the remains of our campfire the next morning, everyone had a story. 2 others had heard the footsteps and the creature going through our supplies. One had even heard heavy breathing outside his tent, but had been too frightened to look. We found our cooler knocked over, food packages torn open, and large, strange impressions in the soft ground near the creek. Not quite footprints, but definitely signs that something heavy had stood there. Whatever it was had taken most of our food, but hadn't touched the beer, which for some reason struck us as funny in our sleep-deprived, adrenaline-crashed state. Later that day, before we packed up to leave, we decided to check out the old cabin again. This time, looking more carefully, we found what appeared to be old bedding spots in the corners, areas where the dust and debris had been cleared away, and soft materials like leaves and grass had been piled up. Some of these piles looked relatively fresh. It seemed like something had been living there, or at least using it for shelter, until we had shown up. The strangest part about both encounters is that I never felt threatened. Terrified, yes, but not in danger. It felt more like we had stumbled into something's territory, and it was curious about us, checking us out, taking our food out of necessity or opportunity, but not wanting to harm us. I've spent years thinking about what we encountered those 2 August nights in Indiana. I've read about known wildlife in the area, looked into local legends, even researched more fringe explanations. Nothing quite fits what we experienced. I still go camping regularly, but I've never gone back to that property. Some experiences you only need to have once to last a lifetime, and sometimes not having answers is better than what the truth might be. Story 17. I'm not sure why I'm finally sharing this after so many years. Maybe because I'm older now and don't much care if folks think I'm crazy. But what happened to me and my hunting buddies back in 1961 near Alpine in Benton County, Oregon, well, it's stuck with me all these years like a splinter under my skin that never worked its way out. It was mid-October, crisp autumn weather, the kind where your breath makes little clouds in the early morning. I'd gone deer hunting with 3 friends, Roy, Frank, and Dennis. We'd known each other since high school and had been doing these hunting trips for years. Nothing special about this one, or so we thought. That morning, Dennis had gotten lucky and shot a decent-sized buck. It wasn't a trophy by any means, but it would have given his family good meat for the winter. The deer had run off after being hit, which happens sometimes. Dennis was sure he'd made a good shot, so we decided to come back late afternoon to track it and haul it out before dark. We spent the day fishing at a nearby creek, telling the same old jokes and stories we always did. Normal day, just a normal damn day. That's what makes what happened later so much harder to process, even now. Around 4 in the afternoon, we packed up our gear and headed back to where Dennis had shot the deer. The place was about 2 miles into the woods from the logging road where we'd parked. It was starting to get that golden hour light, where the sun is getting low and everything takes on this amber color. Beautiful, if I hadn't come to associate it with what happened next. We found the blood trail easy enough. Dennis had indeed made a good shot. We followed the spatters about 100 yards to where the deer should have dropped, but it wasn't there. "This don't make sense," Frank said, scratching his head. "Animal this size, with that kind of shot placement, should be right here." That's when we noticed the drag marks. Clear as day, something had pulled that deer away. The forest floor was disturbed, leaves pushed aside in a wide path, broken branches, more blood. But the weird thing was the size of the disturbance. It looked like something big had moved through there. Cougar, maybe, I suggested, but even as I said it, I knew better. Mountain lions don't make trails that wide. Roy pointed to the brush. "Look at how high up some of these branches are broken. That's got to be 7, 8 feet off the ground." A nervous feeling started crawling up my spine. We all carried rifles, sure, but something felt off. Really off. "Let's just find the deer and get out of here," Dennis said. I could tell he was feeling it too. It was getting darker faster than we expected. The tall pines blocked what little sunlight was left, so I switched on my flashlight. We continued following the drag trail, all of us tense and quiet now. We'd gone maybe another 50 yards when we heard it, thrashing in the woods to our right, like something big was moving through the underbrush. Not trying to be quiet. Not at all. We all froze. My heart started hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The sound stopped. Silence hung in the air, but that weird feeling that we weren't alone got stronger. I don't know what possessed me to do it. Maybe I needed to know what we were dealing with. Maybe it was just reflex. But I swung my flashlight beam toward where the sound had come from, and there it was. My brain did this strange thing where it tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Bear, I thought initially. Has to be a bear standing on its hind legs, but it wasn't a bear. It couldn't be. This thing was standing fully upright, the way a human stands, natural-like. Not like a bear balancing awkwardly. Its proportions were all wrong for any animal I'd ever seen. Long arms hanging down, almost to its knees, broad shoulders narrowing at the waist. And its face. God, its face. That's what I can't forget. It wasn't an animal face, not really. It had features that were almost human-like, a flatter face than a bear's, a distinct brow, a nose and mouth configuration that was just wrong for an animal. Its eyes caught my flashlight beam and reflected back, but not like a deer's or coyote's eyes do. These eyes absorbed the light somehow, dark and deep and aware, intelligent. There was something behind those eyes looking back at me, assessing me. I'm 5'10", and I had to tilt my flashlight up to fully illuminate its face. Had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe more. It was covered in dark hair, not fur exactly, more like hair, matted in some places, longer in others. And the smell, I don't know how I forgot to mention the smell, like wet dog and something rotting and musky sweat all mixed together. It hit me suddenly, making my stomach turn. For what felt like an eternity, we just stared at each other. Me, with my flashlight clutched so tight my knuckles were white, and this creature completely still except for its chest moving with each breath. I couldn't speak. My mouth went bone dry. I heard Frank behind me whisper something that might have been Jesus Christ, or maybe just a prayer. Then Dennis's rifle clattered to the ground. He dropped it from shaking so hard, and the spell broke. We ran, all 4 of us, at the same moment, without saying a word to each other. Pure instinct took over. I don't remember deciding to run. My legs just started moving. We crashed through the brush back toward the logging road, branches whipping our faces, stumbling over roots and rocks. Nobody looked back. Nobody wanted to know if it was following. The car seemed so much further away than I remembered. My lungs were burning, and I could hear my friends' ragged breathing as they ran alongside me. We finally broke out onto the logging road, and I fumbled in my pocket for the keys to my old Chevy. That's when the real fear set in. Those moments at the car were worse than seeing the creature. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't get the key in the door. I dropped them once, swore, picked them up. Roy was yelling at me to hurry. Frank was looking back toward the woods, his face pale as a sheet in the fading light. Dennis just kept saying, "Go, go, go," over and over. I finally got the door unlocked. We piled in, and I jammed the key into the ignition, turned it. Nothing happened. I tried again. The engine cranked but wouldn't catch. In that moment, I thought we were done for. I really did. My stomach dropped like I was falling from a great height. "It's coming," Frank whispered from the back seat. I didn't want to look, but I did. In the rear-view mirror, I could see it. The creature had emerged from the tree line and was standing there, maybe 30 yards behind our car, just watching. Its size was even more apparent in the open. It towered over the small bushes at the edge of the road. I turned the key again, pumping the gas pedal. "Come on, come on!" I yelled at the car. The engine finally caught, roaring to life. I threw it into drive and floored it, the tires spinning on the dirt road before finding purchase. As we sped away, dust billowing behind us, I checked the mirror one last time. It was closer now, much closer than it should have been if it had just been walking. It stood in the middle of the logging road, growing smaller in the mirror as we pulled away, but I could still make out its silhouette against the darkening sky. It didn't chase after us, it just stood there, watching us leave. None of us spoke for the first 20 minutes of that drive. The only sound was our breathing, still heavy from running and fear. When we finally started talking, it was in short, clipped sentences. "Did you see that thing? What the hell was it? Its eyes." Nobody's gonna believe this. And nobody did, really. We told a few people in town, but got the reactions you'd expect. Raised eyebrows, jokes about moonshine in the woods, suggestions that maybe we'd seen a bear in bad light. But we all knew what we saw wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything that's supposed to exist. We never went back for the deer. Never went back to that part of the woods at all. Roy and Frank and Dennis are all gone now. Heart attack took Roy in '86. Cancer got Frank in '93. And Dennis had a stroke 5 years back. I'm the last one left who saw it. I've heard the stories about Bigfoot over the years, seen the blurry photos and read the accounts. Some of them match what we experienced, some don't. I don't know what to believe anymore. All I know is what I saw that day, and the terror I felt. Real, primal terror that I've never felt before or since. Sometimes I wake up at night and I'm back in that car, turning the key, praying for the engine to start. And in my dreams, sometimes it doesn't start. Sometimes I look up and that thing is right outside my window, looking in at me with those two intelligent eyes. What was it doing out there? Why did it take that deer? And why didn't it chase us when it clearly could have caught us if it wanted to? I don't know if I'll ever have answers. I'm 78 years old now, and I've lived a good life despite carrying this memory. But every time I hear branches breaking in the woods or catch an unusual smell on the wind, I wonder if it's still out there, watching, waiting. And sometimes I could swear something watches my cabin at night from just beyond the tree line. Something tall and patient that remembers me as clearly as I remember it. Story 18. I still think about it every time November rolls around. Like a weird anniversary of the day I looked death in the eyes. Not many people believe me when I tell them what happened in Gunnison National Forest back in 2010. But I know what I saw. Mark knows too, though we don't talk about it much anymore. Some things just change you forever, you know? We'd been hunting in Colorado for 3 days without much luck. Mark and I had been friends since high school, both grew up hunting with our dads, and we'd made this trip an annual tradition. Usually we'd have tagged something by the second day, but this year the elk were being particularly elusive. The weather had been weird, unusually warm for November, then suddenly dropping to freezing at night. The animals seemed off their normal patterns. On the third day, we finally got lucky. We'd hiked about 4 miles from our camp, following fresh tracks through a dense section of forest, until we emerged at the edge of this beautiful meadow. The sun was just hitting it right, and there he was, a magnificent bull elk grazing peacefully about 100 yards out. I remember Mark nudging me with his elbow, both of us barely breathing, afraid to spook it. I took the shot. Clean through the lungs, the elk stumbled, ran about 20 yards and collapsed. That moment should have been triumphant. After 3 days of tracking and waiting, we finally had our elk. We approached it cautiously. Always make sure they're dead before you get too close. Then set our packs down and started field dressing it right there in the meadow. We were about halfway through the process when everything changed. I was elbow deep in the chest cavity when I suddenly realized how quiet it had gotten. I mean, dead silent. If you've spent any time in the woods, you know it's never actually silent. There's always something, birds, insects, the wind through the trees, but right then, nothing. It was like someone had hit a mute button on the entire forest. I looked up at Mark, and I could tell he'd noticed it too. His hands had stopped moving, and he was looking around with this confused expression. "You hear that?" I whispered. "I don't hear anything," he whispered back, and that was exactly the problem. Then the smell hit us. Look, I've been hunting my whole life. I know what death smells like, what animal musk smells like, what scat smells like. This wasn't any of those things. It was this overpowering, thick, musky odor that seemed to coat the back of my throat, like wet dog mixed with something rotten and something else I can't even describe. It was so strong it made my eyes water. That's when I saw Mark's face change. He was staring past me toward the tree line at the edge of the meadow, and all the color had drained from his face. I'll never forget the look in his eyes, pure, primal fear. I turned slowly, my hand still sticky with the elk's blood, and that's when I saw it. Standing at the edge of the trees, partially shadowed but clearly visible, was something. My brain kept trying to make it into a bear because that would have made sense. But it wasn't a bear, not even close. It was standing upright on 2 legs, completely still, watching us. It had these impossibly wide shoulders, wider than any human I've ever seen, and arms that hung down almost to its knees. The body was massive, covered in dark hair or fur that moved slightly in the breeze. But it was the face that froze my blood. It had this sloped forehead and deep-set eyes under heavy brow ridges. And those eyes, dark, intelligent eyes, were fixed directly on us. Not like an animal glancing in your direction, but deliberately staring, studying, assessing. The thing was breathing heavily, its massive chest heaving up and down, sending small clouds of vapor into the cold air with each exhale. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. My mind was spinning, trying to categorize what I was seeing into something that made sense. A bear? No. A man in a costume? Absolutely not. No costume could capture the raw, muscular bulk of this thing. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. Mark whispered something behind me so quietly I barely heard him. "What the fuck is that?" I just shook my head slowly, not taking my eyes off the creature. We stood there frozen for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds, locked in this bizarre standoff. The creature and us, separated by 50 yards of open meadow, just staring at each other while that terrible smell hung in the air. Then it happened. The thing opened its mouth, a mouth too wide for a human face, and let out a sound I still hear in my nightmares. It wasn't a bear's roar or a mountain lion's scream. It was deeper, more guttural, almost like it came from something with a chest cavity twice the size of a human's. The roar echoed across the meadow, bouncing off the mountains around us, seeming to shake the very ground. And then it charged. I've seen bears run. I've seen moose charge. This was different. This thing moved with purpose, with a speed that shouldn't have been possible for something so large. It came down the slope toward us, crashing through saplings like they were blades of grass, covering ground at a terrifying pace. I don't remember consciously deciding to run. Pure instinct took over. I dropped the knife I'd been using, abandoned our packs, the elk quarters, everything. Just turned and ran toward the far side of the meadow where the trees were thickest. I remember hearing Mark behind me, his breathing harsh and panicked. For a second, I glanced back and saw Mark had raised his rifle. He hesitated, aiming it at the charging creature, but then seemed to think better of it. What good would a .30-06 do against something like that? He slung it over his shoulder and ran after me. The sound of the creature pursuing us was like nothing I've ever heard. A combination of heavy footfalls, cracking branches, and these deep, angry grunts. It was gaining on us. I knew it was. Every muscle in my body was screaming as we sprinted across that meadow, but I knew we couldn't outrun it. Nothing human could outrun that thing. We hit the tree line on the other side of the meadow and kept going, crashing through underbrush, jumping over fallen logs, branches whipping at our faces. I remember thinking, this is how I die, in these woods, killed by something that shouldn't exist. And then suddenly, the crashing behind us stopped. We ran another 20 or 30 yards before we realized the sound of pursuit was gone. Both of us slowed, then stopped, bent over and gasping for air. After a moment, we turned back to look. The creature was standing at the top of a small rise about 100 yards away. It hadn't followed us into the dense trees. Instead, it just stood there, watching, its massive chest heaving with those steamy breaths in the cold air. For several seconds, it stared directly at us, and I swear I could feel the weight of its gaze even at that distance. Then it threw its head back and let out one final roar. A sound so loud and so furious that birds erupted from the trees all around us. It shook its massive arms in what looked like a display of rage or frustration, and then, with surprising quickness, it turned and disappeared back into the forest on the other side of the meadow. We stood there for what felt like forever, neither of us speaking, just trying to process what had happened. Finally, Mark broke the silence. "We need to get the hell out of here." We didn't talk much on the hike back to camp. What was there to say? We'd both seen it, both heard it, both smelled that terrible odor that still seemed to cling to our clothes. There was no question in either of our minds about what had happened. When we reached camp, we packed up in record time, not even bothering to properly organize our gear, just stuffed everything into our packs and the truck as quickly as possible. We left the elk behind. At that point, neither of us cared about the wasted tag or the meat. We just wanted to get away from those woods. The drive back down the mountain was tense. We kept checking the rear-view mirrors as if expecting to see that thing following us down the road. It was only when we hit the main highway that we finally started to relax a little. "What do we tell people?" Mark eventually asked. I thought about it for a minute. "Nothing," I said. "No one would believe us anyway." And he was right. The few people I've told over the years usually react with polite skepticism at best or outright mockery at worst. "A Bigfoot," they say, rolling their eyes. "You sure you boys weren't hitting the whiskey a little hard up there?" But I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a man in a costume. It was something else entirely. Something powerful, intelligent and furious that we had killed that elk in what it apparently considered its territory. The strangest part is, I'm convinced it could have caught us if it wanted to. The way it moved, the ground it covered so quickly, it could have run us down in seconds if it had followed us into those trees. But it didn't. It stopped at the edge of the forest and let us go. Was it just trying to scare us away? Was killing that elk enough? I don't know. What I do know is that I've never gone back to Gunnison National Forest. Mark and I still hunt together sometimes, but always in different areas now, and we're much more cautious about where we set up camp. And sometimes, when we're sitting around the fire at night, one of us will get a certain look, and I know we're both thinking about it. That day in the meadow, the unnatural silence, the smell, and those intelligent, rage-filled eyes staring at us from a face that shouldn't exist. I've researched a lot since then, found online forums where people share similar experiences. Turns out the Gunnison area has a history of sightings going back decades. Some people claim these creatures are just territorial, protecting their land. Others think they're something more sinister. All I know is that something was out there watching us that day, something that didn't want us in its forest. Something that could have torn us apart but chose not to. And every November, when the days get shorter and the air gets that certain crisp quality, I remember, and I wonder if it remembers us too.